What if I told you that the history you learned in school was carefully edited, that the textbooks sitting in classrooms across America were missing entire chapters? Not because the events didn't happen, but because someone somewhere decided you didn't need to know about them. That the stories were too uncomfortable, too embarrassing, or too damaging to the carefully constructed image of a nation that always does the right thing. You probably learned about Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. You probably memorized the amendments. You probably wrote a paper about Manifest Destiny that somehow made westward expansion sound like a polite road trip. But what about the things that never made it into those glossy textbooks? What about the operations that were classified for decades? The programs that only came to light because someone got brave or careless or both? What about the decisions made in sealed rooms by people in expensive suits that changed the lives of millions of Americans who never even knew what had happened to them? Here's something your history teacher probably never said out loud. The most important events in American history are sometimes the ones that were never officially scheduled to happen. We're not talking about conspiracy theories. We're not talking about the kind of thing your neighbor prints out and leaves under your windshield wiper. Everything you're about to hear is documented, declassified, confirmed. These are facts that lived in sealed vaults, classified memos, and congressional hearing transcripts until someone finally forced the light in. And once you hear them, you cannot unhear them. 100 facts. That's what tonight is. 100 moments, programs, operations, and decisions that the official history of America would very much prefer you forget about. Some of them will make you angry. Some of them will genuinely keep you up at night, which is either ironic or appropriate depending on why you're here. Some of them will make you look at familiar names and famous landmarks completely differently. And some of them will make you realize that the strangest, most unbelievable chapters of American history weren't written by conspiracy theorists. They were written by the government itself, then quickly locked away. These are the stories of ordinary people used as test subjects without their knowledge. Of military officials who drafted plans so extreme that even hardened generals eventually said no. Of scientists brought to America with blood still on their hands because someone decided their expertise was more valuable than their crimes. Of elections manipulated, economies destabilized, and lives destroyed in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map, all in the name of national security and democratic values. This is also a story about what happens when the truth finally does come out. Because here's what's interesting. In most of these cases, the government didn't exactly come clean voluntarily. It took whistleblowers who risked everything. It took journalists who were threatened, discredited, and sometimes worse. It took lawsuits filed by people who had nothing left to lose. It took declassification schedules that forced documents into the public record whether anyone wanted them there or not. The truth didn't walk in through the front door. It was dragged in through a broken window. Now before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give this video a like because dark history doesn't exactly get promoted by the algorithm on its own. And I genuinely need your help making sure these stories reach people who should know them. These aren't just interesting facts. They're the kind of information that changes how you understand power, accountability, and the gap between what governments say and what they actually do. A quick note before we start. This list is going to move through history in a loose but deliberate way. Some of these facts are connected. Some of them will echo each other across decades, which is itself a kind of lesson. And if you find yourself thinking, wait, they did that again, that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns are what history is actually made of. So get comfortable. Dim the lights if they're not already dim. This is a long one, and it should be, because 100 facts about the hidden corners of American history deserves the kind of attention we rarely give to anything anymore. No rushing, no skipping ahead. Just you, the dark, and a century's worth of things that someone really hoped would stay buried. A few of these you may have heard whispers of before. Most of them you haven't. And even the ones you think you know, I promise you don't know all of it. The details are where it lives. The details are what makes your stomach drop. 100 facts, some hidden in plain sight, some locked away for decades. All of them real. All of them documented. All of them waiting for exactly this moment. Let's begin. 1. Before we get to the things the government classified, let's go further back. To the stories that were never secret. Exactly. They were just quietly left out. The parts of early American history that didn't fit the narrative of inevitable progress and heroic founding. Because the truth is, Even before the United States existed, this land was already producing stories stranger and more complicated than anything in your 7th grade textbook. And the first one starts not in Jamestown, not in Plymouth, but in Florida, under a Spanish flag, in a town most Americans have never once heard of. 2. Fort Mose in 1738. Decades before the United States was even a thought, Spain established Fort Mose in Florida. It was the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what would become North America. Enslaved people who escaped from British colonies to the south could reach Spanish Florida and receive their freedom, provided they converted to Catholicism and agreed to defend the settlement. The Spanish had a practical reason. They wanted a buffer between their territory and the British colonies pushing south. So they armed formerly enslaved people and gave them land and legal status. Fort Mose had its own militia, its own government structure, its own community. These were people who had risked everything, crossed brutal terrain, and arrived not as refugees begging for mercy but as settlers with legal rights. The town was attacked, rebuilt, and eventually abandoned when Spain ceded Florida to Britain in 1763. Most of its residents relocated to Cuba rather than live under British rule again. Fort Mose existed for 25 years. It proved that legal freedom for black people in North America was possible long before the Civil War. Your textbook just never mentioned it. 3. The lost colony of Roanoke. In 1587, 115 English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. 3 years later, when supply ships finally returned, every single one of them was gone. No bodies, no signs of a fight, no burned buildings, nothing except one word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. That was it. The entire settlement had vanished, and that single carved word is all they left behind. The Croatoan were a nearby native nation. Some historians believe the colonists integrated with them voluntarily. Others think disease, starvation, or conflict drove them to seek shelter elsewhere. The governor who came back looking for them, John White, had actually left the colony to get supplies. He was delayed by a war with Spain. By the time he returned, there was no one left to ask. The mystery has never been definitively solved. Searches have continued for centuries. The word Croatoan remains the only concrete evidence that anything happened at all. 400 years later, we still don't know. 4. The first Africans in Virginia. In August 1619, a ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying what historical documents describe as 20 and odd Africans. They had been captured from a Portuguese slave ship. They were sold to English colonists in exchange for food. This is the first recorded arrival of Africans in English North America. But here's the part that complicates the familiar story. In 1619, Virginia had no formal slave code. The legal architecture of chattel slavery had not yet been built. Some of these early Africans were treated in ways that resembled indentured servitude. At least some gained their freedom, acquired land, and even employed others. One man, Anthony Johnson, eventually owned his own farm and livestock. This was not freedom as we understand it. The conditions were brutal, and the system was already sliding towards something worse. But the point is that the transformation of African people in America into permanent, hereditary property was a deliberate legal construction that took decades to fully codify. Slavery was chosen. It was built piece by piece through laws passed by men who knew exactly what they were doing. That distinction matters. 5. The Beaver Wars. In the mid-1600s, the fur trade was essentially the oil industry of North America. And like oil, it made people do terrible things. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which Europeans called the Iroquois, had largely depleted the beaver population in their own territory. To survive economically and maintain their position as trade intermediaries with Dutch and later English colonists, they needed new hunting grounds. What followed was a series of conflicts historians call the Beaver Wars, lasting from roughly 1609 to 1701. The Haudenosaunee systematically attacked neighboring nations. The Huron Confederacy, which had allied with the French, was effectively destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were killed or dispersed. Entire nations were scattered across the continent. Villages that had existed for generations disappeared. This was not a simple story of European colonizers versus native peoples. It was a catastrophic conflict driven by the economic pressures that European trade had introduced into existing indigenous political structures. The fur trade didn't just extract resources, It destabilized entire civilizations. And then Europe moved on to the next thing. 6. The 1663 Carolina Constitution. Here is an odd footnote that most people never encounter. In 1669, the philosopher John Locke, yes, that John Locke, the one whose ideas about natural rights and government helped inspire the Declaration of Independence, helped draft a constitution for the Carolina colony. It was called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, and it was deeply, almost comically, contradictory. On one hand, it contained some genuinely progressive ideas about religious toleration. On the other, it created a rigid hereditary aristocracy. The document invented entirely new noble titles, like Landgrave and Cacique, for a colony in the American wilderness. It imagined a feudal system transplanted wholesale onto the Atlantic coast. It also explicitly recognized and protected the institution of slavery. Locke, who wrote extensively about liberty and the rights of man, helped design a legal framework that enshrined the ownership of human beings. The fundamental constitutions were never fully implemented and were eventually abandoned. But the document is a useful reminder that the men who built the intellectual foundations of American freedom were often doing something very different in practice. 7. King Philip's War. Most Americans have never heard of King Philip's War. That is remarkable given what it actually was. From 1675 to 1676, a conflict erupted between English colonists in New England and a coalition of native nations led by a Wampanoag leader the colonists called King Philip. His actual name was Metacom. The war was devastating on a scale that is almost impossible to absorb. Proportionally, King Philip's War killed a larger share of the New England population than any other war in American history. More than the Civil War, more than World War II, entire towns were burned. Thousands of colonists were killed. Native casualties were even more catastrophic. Thousands died in battle. Thousands more died of disease and starvation. Survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Metacom was captured, executed, and his head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. The war broke native resistance in southern New England permanently. And yet it appears in almost no standard history curriculum, because the story of how English colonists nearly lost everything and what they did to win it back does not fit cleanly into the narrative of inevitable peaceful settlement. So it was quietly left out. And speaking of stories quietly left out, the Salem witch trials have their own hidden details that textbooks glaze right over. 8. The Salem garlic remedy. Most people know the broad strokes of the Salem witch trials: accusations, hysteria, executions. What they don't tell you is how genuinely strange the examination process was. When accused individuals were brought before magistrates, their guilt or innocence was assessed partly through folk beliefs that had nothing to do with law or evidence. Accusers would fall into convulsive fits the moment a suspect looked at them. Touch tests were performed, where the accused physically touched a convulsing accuser to see if the fits stopped, which was considered proof of witchcraft. Household remedies and folk magic were used by accusers themselves trying to identify witches, including baking witch cakes made with rye and the afflicted person's urine, then feeding them to dogs to see what happened. The entire legal framework was built on superstition treated as science. 19 people were hanged. One was pressed to death with stones. The colony eventually admitted the trials were a mistake. It took them 200 years to fully exonerate everyone. 9 Ona judges escape. George Washington is on the dollar bill. He has a monument. He has his own national holiday. What your history class didn't mention is that he spent years obsessively trying to recapture an enslaved woman who had the audacity to run. Ona Judge had lived in the Washington household her entire life. When she learned she was to be given as a wedding gift to one of Martha Washington's granddaughters, she slipped out of the Philadelphia presidential residence in 1796 and vanished. Washington was furious. He used federal contacts and the Treasury Department to track her down. He sent agents to New Hampshire, where she had settled and was living freely. She was interviewed by one of his agents. She told him she would return willingly only if promised freedom upon the Washingtons' deaths. Washington refused. He kept trying to recapture her through back channels, pressuring officials for years. Ona Judge lived free in New Hampshire until she died in 1848, decades after Washington himself was gone. She outlasted him. She won 10, the Stono Rebellion. In September 1739, Near the Stono River in South Carolina, a group of enslaved people did something that terrified the white colonial establishment to its core. They fought back. About 20 enslaved people, many of them from the Kingdom of Congo and experienced with weapons, broke into a firearms store, armed themselves and began marching south toward Spanish Florida where freedom was possible. They gathered more people as they moved. They killed around 23 white colonists along the way. They beat drums and called out for liberty. Colonial militia eventually caught them before they reached Florida. The leaders were killed. Survivors were executed. But what the rebellion really produced was fear, and fear produced laws. South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740, one of the most restrictive slave codes in colonial history. Enslaved people were barred from growing their own food, earning money, learning to read, or assembling in groups. The entire surveillance apparatus tightened. Enslavers had revealed what they secretly knew. The people they were holding captive wanted freedom badly enough to die for it. 11. The walking purchase. In 1737, Pennsylvania pulled off one of the most audacious land grabs in colonial history and dressed it up as a legal transaction. Colonial officials claimed they had found an old deed from 1686 that entitled them to land stretching as far as a man could walk in a day and a half. The Lenape people disputed the deed's legitimacy but were pressured to honor the agreement. What the Lenape expected was a casual walk covering maybe 30 or 40 miles. What Pennsylvania delivered was something else entirely. The colonial government hired the 3 fastest runners in the region. They cleared a trail in advance. They eliminated rest stops. They pushed the runners to sprint rather than walk. One runner covered nearly 70 miles before collapsing. The area seized was roughly 1.2 million acres of Lenape territory. The Lenape protested immediately, calling it a cheat. The Iroquois Confederacy, who Pennsylvania leveraged as political pressure against the Lenape, helped force them off the land anyway. The Lenape were driven into the Wyoming Valley and beyond. The walking purchase became a textbook example of how legal paperwork was used to steal a continent one fraudulent transaction at a time. 12. Benjamin Lay's protest. In 1738, a 4'7" Quaker abolitionist named Benjamin Lay walked into the Burlington, New Jersey Quaker yearly meeting and staged one of the most theatrical protests in American history. Lay was a hunchbacked, cave-dwelling radical who had lived in Barbados, witnessed chattel slavery firsthand, and returned to Pennsylvania absolutely incandescent with moral fury. He stood before the assembled Quakers in a military coat concealing a hollowed-out book filled with a bladder of red pokeberry juice. He delivered a speech condemning slaveholding Quakers in terms that were not polite. Then he raised the book above his head and drove a sword through it. Red juice splattered across the crowd, spattering the coats and faces of Quaker elders like a sudden wound. His message was explicit. This is what you're doing. This is the blood you have on your hands. He was removed from the meeting. He was disowned by the Quakers multiple times. He kept coming back. Benjamin Franklin published one of his pamphlets. It took 50 more years, but the Quakers eventually became one of the first religious groups to formally ban slaveholding. Lay didn't live to see it. He would have been furious that it took so long. 13. The 1741 New York conspiracy trials. In the spring of 1741, a series of fires broke out across New York City. Panic set in. Officials became convinced that enslaved black New Yorkers were conspiring with poor white criminals to burn the city and trigger a general uprising. What followed was one of the most severe episodes of judicial hysteria in colonial American history. Based largely on the testimony of a teenage indentured servant named Mary Burton, who was promised her freedom in exchange for information, authorities arrested more than 150 people. 34 were executed, 17 were hanged, 13 were burned at the stake. Dozens more were sold into bondage in the Caribbean and transported out of the colony entirely. The evidence was almost entirely fabricated or coerced. No credible proof of an organized conspiracy was ever produced. The fires may have been accidental, but the city's white establishment was so terrified of the enslaved population living among them that they executed dozens of people on the word of one teenager who had every incentive to keep talking. The trials exposed how thin the line was between colonial order and colonial panic. 14. The Albany Plan of Union. In 1754, Benjamin Franklin sat down and drafted something remarkable. a proposal to unite the American colonies under a single governing body with a president general appointed by the Crown and a Grand Council elected by colonial assemblies. It was called the Albany Plan of Union. Franklin had a practical reason. The French and Indian War was beginning, and the colonies were useless at coordinating defense because each one acted entirely in its own interest. He believed collective government was the only logical solution. The delegates at the Albany Congress actually approved the plan. Then it went to the individual colonial assemblies, and every single one of them rejected it. They didn't want to share power. They didn't want to pay shared taxes. They didn't want anyone else telling them what to do. The British Crown also rejected it because giving colonies that much self-governance made them nervous. Franklin later noted, with some bitterness, that if the plan had been adopted, the revolution might never have been necessary. The colonies spent 20 more years learning the hard way that he was right. 15. The Paxton Boys' March. While Franklin was dreaming about unity on paper, other Pennsylvanians were expressing themselves with axes and rifles. In 1763, a group of Scotch-Irish frontiersmen from Paxton Township decided that the real problem with frontier violence wasn't white settlers murdering native people, it was that the colony wasn't murdering enough. They descended on the tiny Conestoga community, a peaceful Christian native group under official protection, and slaughtered 6 people in cold blood. The survivors were placed in protective custody in Lancaster. The Paxton Boys broke into the jail and killed them too, men, women, and children. Not one attacker was prosecuted. Emboldened, they then marched hundreds strong toward Philadelphia, demanding that the colonial government endorse their actions and adopt harsher anti-native policies. Benjamin Franklin personally helped negotiate them down rather than ordering them arrested. The message was clear to native communities. Even when you followed every colonial rule, even when you sought official protection, a white mob could annihilate you and then demand thanks, and the authorities would look for compromises instead of justice. 16. Crispus Attucks. A dozen years later in Boston, another mob scene produced one of the Revolution's first martyrs, and his identity rarely gets the attention it deserves. On March 5, 1770, tensions between British soldiers and Boston residents finally snapped. Snowballs, ice, and insults gave way to musket fire. 5 colonists died in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The very first person to fall was Crispus Attucks, a sailor and dock worker of African and native descent, likely formerly enslaved. He had lived his life at the bottom of colonial society's racial hierarchy, switching between whaling voyages and waterfront labor. That night, witnesses say he stood at the front of the crowd, a tall man with a club, facing down armed soldiers in defense of a city that did not consider him fully human under its own laws. When Paul Revere engraved his famous image of the massacre, Attucks' black and native identity was visually softened. When patriots turned the dead into symbols, they rarely emphasized that the first blood of the revolution came from a man whose very existence challenged the slave-holding ideals of liberty they were about to proclaim. 17. The Pine Tree Riot. Boston gets the Tea Party, with costumes and slogans and commemorations. New Hampshire got a lumber fight that history mostly forgot. Under British law, any white pine tree of a certain size was reserved for the Crown's navy and marked with the King's broad arrow. Colonial mill owners and loggers were supposed to leave these trees alone or pay stiff fines. In practice, they often cut them anyway. In 1772, the Royal Surveyor cracked down in the town of Weir, fining local mill owners for illegal timber. When the sheriff came to enforce the penalties, a group of townsmen decided they'd had enough. They dragged the sheriff from his bed in the middle of the night, beat him, cut his horse's mane and tail, and drove him out of town. The incident became known as the Pine Tree Riot, one of the earliest organized acts of violent resistance to British authority in New England. Years later, New Hampshire's state flag would feature a lone pine tree, a quiet reference to a time when people were willing to assault royal officials over trees long before tea ever hit the harbor. 18. The Gaspé Affair. Before Boston patriots dressed as Mohawks and dumped tea, Rhode Islanders had already taken the step that really mattered, destroying a British warship. The HMS Gaspé was a customs schooner stationed off Rhode Island to enforce trade laws and chase smugglers. Its commander was famously aggressive, stopping ships, seizing cargo, and angering local merchants. On June 9, 1772, while pursuing a packet boat near Providence, the Gaspé ran aground on a sandbar. That night, a group of colonists quietly rowed out, boarded the stranded vessel, wounded the captain, and set the ship on fire. By morning, the Gaspé was a charred wreck. The British government was furious, launching a special commission to find and ship the culprits to London for trial. The investigation went nowhere because witnesses suddenly developed collective amnesia. No one would talk. In many ways, this was the first open, organized attack on British military property in the colonies, a dress rehearsal for the violence to come, carried out not in the famous streets of Boston, but in the quieter coves of Narragansett Bay. 19. Haym Salomon's revolutionary financing. While soldiers froze at Valley Forge and politicians delivered speeches about liberty, someone still had to pay the bills, and that job fell partly to an immigrant broker named Haym Salomon. Born in Poland and fluent in multiple languages, he arrived in New York and became active in patriot circles. Arrested by the British as a suspected spy, he avoided execution and used his position to encourage Hessian mercenaries to desert. After escaping to Philadelphia, he set up as a broker and became the financial middleman for the Continental Congress. The new government had no reliable tax base, little hard currency, and constant expenses. Salomon arranged loans, converted foreign bills, advanced his own money, and helped turn French and Dutch credit into usable funds. When members of Congress needed personal loans to stay in Philadelphia and keep governing, he lent to them too. By the time the war ended, he was deeply in debt and died relatively poor. Later legends exaggerated his role, but surviving records show that without people like Haym Salomon quietly juggling numbers and risking bankruptcy, the lofty rhetoric of independence might have collapsed under unpaid wages and empty supply wagons. 20. Deborah Sampson's enlistment. For all the talk of founding fathers, some of the most determined people in the Revolution weren't supposed to be on the battlefield at all. Deborah Sampson was a Massachusetts woman who, in 1782, bound her chest, put on men's clothes, and enlisted in the Continental Army under the name Robert Shirtliff. She served in a light infantry company, one of the most dangerous assignments, and saw combat in several skirmishes. When she was wounded, she reportedly removed a musket ball from her own thigh to avoid detection by army surgeons. She kept her identity secret for over a year, marching, drilling, and sharing tents like any other soldier. Her disguise was finally discovered when she fell seriously ill and was treated in a hospital where a doctor realized she was a woman. Instead of punishing her, General Washington granted her an honorable discharge and a bit of traveling money. After the war, she had to fight again, this time for a military pension, arguing that her service counted even if she had technically never been allowed to serve. Congress eventually agreed, grudgingly acknowledging that courage in uniform had not been limited by gender. 21. The Culper Spy Ring, Inc. Not all revolutionary battles involved muskets and cannons. Some were fought with laundry lines, coded letters, and invisible ink. In 1778, George Washington authorized a spy network operating out of British-occupied New York and across Long Island, later known as the Culper Spy Ring. Ordinary people, including a dry goods merchant, a farmer, and a mysterious female informant later dubbed Agent 355, gathered intelligence on troop movements and supply shipments. Messages were written in seemingly innocent letters using a numbered codebook, where words and names were replaced with 3-digit numbers. Between the lines, agents used a special invisible ink, sometimes called a sympathetic stain, developed with the help of Washington's spymaster and a chemistry-minded officer. The ink only appeared when brushed with a specific reagent, allowing secrets to travel unnoticed through enemy hands. Laundry hung in certain patterns signaled when it was safe to meet. The British never fully cracked the system. Information from the Culper Ring helped Washington avoid traps, plan movements, and even disrupt a plot to sabotage the French fleet, all accomplished by people whose names mostly vanished from memory while the generals took the credit. 22. The Turtle Submarine. While Washington's army stumbled through defeats on land, an inventor in Connecticut was quietly building something that looked like a wooden acorn and changed how war at sea was imagined. In 1776, David Bushnell unveiled the Turtle, a one-man submarine designed to sneak under British warships in New York Harbor and attach explosive charges to their hulls. The pilot sat in a cramped, water-filled shell, hand-cranking propellers, steering by compass and tiny glass ports, breathing through tubes that stuck up above the surface. At night, Sergeant Ezra Lee tried to pilot the Turtle toward the massive British ship HMS Eagle, flagship of the fleet. Battling strong currents and darkness, he maneuvered underneath but couldn't drill the explosive screw into the copper-sheathed hull. After repeated attempts, exhausted and discovered, he released the time charge and escaped while it exploded harmlessly in the water, terrifying nearby sailors. The Turtle never successfully sank a ship, and later attempts also failed, but the idea lingered. The British suddenly had to imagine that the water beneath their warships might conceal unseen attackers, and the young United States had, for a fleeting moment, literally tried to wage underwater guerrilla warfare. 23. The Newburgh Conspiracy. By the end of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army camped at Newburgh, New York, was filled with exhausted officers who had fought for years without reliable pay. Congress was broke, the states were squabbling, and the promises of pensions and back wages looked more like fantasies than obligations. In 1783, anonymous letters began circulating among the officers, suggesting that perhaps the army should not peacefully disband, perhaps it should demand justice more forcefully, perhaps even refuse to obey civilian authority until its terms were met. It wasn't quite an open coup, but it was close enough to frighten everyone who remembered that the whole revolution had been fought to replace military rule with civilian government. George Washington responded by calling a meeting and appearing before the officers himself. He started reading a prepared speech, then paused, fumbling with a new pair of spectacles. Apologizing softly, he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." The room fell silent as hardened men realized their commander had sacrificed as much as they had. Many wept. The mood broke. Washington urged them to reject any hint of mutiny and trust that Congress would act. They did. The so-called Newburgh Conspiracy evaporated, and with it one of the most serious chances for the American Revolution to devour its own ideals at the moment of victory. 24. The Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783. Even with Washington calming the officers at Newburgh, the problem of unpaid soldiers did not disappear, and in Philadelphia it boiled over. In June 1783, several hundred Continental soldiers, many from Pennsylvania regiments, marched into the city, muskets in hand, and surrounded the State House, where the Confederation Congress and state officials met. They were not foreign invaders. They were veterans who had spent years in brutal campaigns, now angry at being dismissed with little or no pay and worthless paper promises. They demanded immediate action and back wages, effectively holding Congress hostage. The Pennsylvania government, nervous about using the local militia against fellow soldiers who were popular with many civilians, hesitated. Congress, feeling abandoned and threatened, made a fateful decision. Rather than confront the mutineers in Philadelphia, they simply left, moving sessions to Princeton, New Jersey, and later to other temporary capitals. The episode embarrassed national leaders and left a deep mark on their thinking. When they later wrote the Constitution, they included provisions for a federal district under direct national control, not subject to a single state's whims, partly to avoid ever again having the national government chased out of town by angry, unpaid troops while local authorities dithered on the sidelines. 25. The fugitive capital at New York's Federal Hall. After scurrying out of Philadelphia and then drifting between places like Princeton, Annapolis, and Trenton, the national government eventually settled, temporarily, in New York City. In 1785, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress met there at Federal Hall, a remodeled customs house at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets. When the new Constitution was ratified, New York became the first capital of the United States under that system. It was in Federal Hall that George Washington took the oath of office in 1789, the first president standing on a balcony above bustling streets that had been Dutch only a century earlier. Inside, Congress debated tariffs, the Bill of Rights, and the basic machinery of the new government. Yet everyone knew New York was not meant to be permanent. Sectional bargaining had already pointed toward a purpose-built capital on the Potomac River as part of a compromise over federal assumption of state debts. By 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act, setting the future site of Washington, D.C., and agreeing to move the capital to Philadelphia while the new city was constructed. New York's moment as the political heart of the country lasted just a few fleeting years, a reminder that for the early republic, even the location of authority was unsettled and constantly on the move. 26. The Whiskey Rebellion's frontier grievances. While the capital floated from city to city, The federal government also floated new ideas for paying its debts, and one of them lit a fuse out west. In 1791, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton pushed through an excise tax on distilled spirits, knowing that whiskey was widely produced and traded. For Western farmers in Pennsylvania and beyond, whiskey wasn't a luxury. It was a kind of liquid currency, easier to transport over bad roads than bulky grain, used to pay debts and wages. The tax hit small frontier distillers far harder than big coastal operations, requiring complex paperwork and cash payments many didn't have. To them, it felt less like national responsibility and more like rich Eastern elites using the new federal power to squeeze poor backcountry families. Resistance grew from grumbling to organized defiance. Tax collectors were harassed, tarred and feathered, their homes burned. Local courts refused to cooperate. By 1794, armed groups had attacked the home of a federal inspector, and talk of secession and rebellion crept through taverns. This time, President Washington chose force over negotiation. He personally led a massive militia army, thousands of men, toward western Pennsylvania, the largest force he had commanded since the Revolution. The rebels mostly melted away before the troops arrived, and only a few were arrested and later pardoned. Still, the message was unmistakable. The new government would enforce its laws, even against former revolutionaries, and the dream of a republic without heavy-handed tax enforcement died somewhere in those misty western hills. 27. The Jay Treaty effigy burnings. If whiskey proved that frontier farmers distrusted the new government, the Jay Treaty showed that plenty of coastal Americans distrusted its diplomacy too. In 1794, with tensions still high between the United States and Great Britain, Chief Justice John Jay negotiated a treaty aimed at avoiding another war. It addressed issues like British forts still on American soil and debt claims from before the Revolution, but it did little for neutral shipping rights or compensation to enslaved people the British had freed and evacuated. When the terms leaked, many Americans saw it as a humiliating surrender to the very empire they had just fought. Federalists argued it bought peace and economic stability. Jeffersonian Republicans saw betrayal. Public meetings exploded in outrage. Crowds burned copies of the treaty. In cities from Boston to Charleston, people burned John Jay in effigy, sometimes hanging, and then setting fire to stuffed figures bearing his name. Newspapers depicted him with a boot on the neck of American liberty. Some rioters pelted him with stones when he appeared in public. George Washington faced fierce criticism for supporting the treaty, and his once unassailable popularity took a visible hit. Yet the Senate narrowly ratified it, and the United States stayed out of war for a few more fragile years, buying time at the cost of deepening partisan divides and a lingering sense among many that their new leaders were already willing to compromise honor for trade. 28. The Haitian Revolution and U.S. fears. While Americans argued over taxes and treaties, a far more radical revolution was unfolding to the South that shook the foundations of their slaveholding republic. In 1791, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, rose in a massive uprising that evolved into a full-scale revolution. Over years of brutal fighting, they defeated French forces and, by 1804, established the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. For white enslavers in the United States, especially in the South, Haiti was not an inspiring sister revolution. It was a nightmare made real. They saw in it stories of plantation burnings, and masters killed the living embodiment of their deepest fears about the people they held in bondage. American newspapers portrayed Haiti as chaos and horror, often ignoring the violence that had long been inflicted on enslaved people there. Southern states tightened slave codes, restricted movement, cracked down on Black gatherings, and policed communication more harshly, determined to prevent Haitian ideas from spreading. Federal policy oscillated between limited trade and anxious quarantine, shaped by worries about both disease and revolution. Even as the United States later benefited from France's desperation to sell Louisiana after losing Haiti, most American leaders refused to formally recognize Haitian independence for decades. The existence of a successful Black republic just offshore was a constant, silent rebuke to American claims about liberty, and it pushed the United States toward harsher surveillance and control of enslaved and free Black communities at home. 29. The Quasi-War. While Haiti's revolution terrified American slaveholders, another revolution in France was quietly dragging the young United States into its own strange conflict at sea. By the late 1790s, relations between the United States and revolutionary France had collapsed over unpaid debts, Jay's treaty with Britain, and mutual suspicion. French privateers began seizing American merchant ships in the Caribbean, claiming they were aiding the British. Congress never declared war, but it authorized American warships and privateers to defend commerce, creating an undeclared naval conflict now called the Quasi-War. Tiny frigates and sloops hunted each other across warm waters, trading cannon fire in battles most Americans never saw. The newly formed U.S. Navy, with ships like the USS Constellation, scored surprising victories against French vessels, boosting national pride and convincing many that a permanent navy was necessary. At the same time, Federalists used the crisis to justify internal crackdowns at home, insisting that foreign danger required domestic discipline. The Quasi-War ended with a negotiated peace in 1800, but it left two lasting legacies: a stronger navy patrolling far from American shores, and a precedent that the United States could wage war without ever formally admitting it was at war. 30. The Alien Friends Act. The tension with France did not just play out in distant waters, it also became an excuse to reshape who was safe inside the country. In 1798, amid fear of French plots and immigrant radicals, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed a series of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. One of them, the Alien Friends Act, gave the president power during peacetime to order any non-citizen he judged dangerous out of the country, without trial, without evidence presented in court, and without meaningful appeal. Immigrants from France and Ireland, many sympathetic to Jefferson's Republicans, suddenly lived under a quiet threat that a signature from John Adams could uproot their lives overnight. Federalists argued the law was necessary to protect national security from foreign agents. Their critics saw a naked attempt to silence opposition and intimidate new voters. The act technically expired in 1800, but the idea that dangerous foreigners could be removed by executive decision never really went away. It resurfaced in later alien and deportation laws, always framed as security, always shadowed by the possibility of using fear to shrink the circle of who counted as safely American. 31. The election of 1800 House deadlock. While Federalists were trying to control who could stay in the country, voters were about to decide who would run it, and the system nearly broke. In the presidential election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr ran together on the Republican ticket, intended as president and vice president. But under the original constitutional rules, each elector cast two undifferentiated votes for president, and the person with the most votes became president, the runner-up vice president. Republican electors all dutifully voted for both men, creating an exact tie. With no clear winner, the election went to the House of Representatives, still controlled by hostile Federalists. For days, the House voted again and again, 35 times, deadlocked as some Federalists toyed with the idea of supporting Burr to block Jefferson. Rumors of armed militias gathering in states, of possible civil conflict if the wrong choice was made, floated through the Capitol. Only after intense backroom negotiations and quiet nudging from Alexander Hamilton did enough Federalists abstain to let Jefferson win on the 36th ballot. The crisis pushed Congress to pass the 12th Amendment, changing how presidents and vice presidents were chosen, and revealed how close the new republic had already come to letting partisan maneuvering overturn an election. 32. The first Barbary War tribute problem. Even as the United States argued over constitutions and elections, its merchant ships sailed into older, harsher political realities on the other side of the Atlantic. For years, North African states along the Barbary coast, like Tripoli and Algiers, captured ships and demanded tribute to let others pass safely, a system European powers mostly accepted as the cost of doing business. The young United States, no longer protected by Britain's navy, suddenly found its sailors seized and its merchants ransomed. Early administrations paid tribute, sending money, goods, and even a warship as a gift, trying to buy peace. But demands kept rising, and humiliation grew. In 1801, when the Pasha of Tripoli demanded more money and then symbolically cut down the flagstaff at the U.S. consulate, President Jefferson decided that was enough. Instead of paying, he sent warships, beginning the First Barbary War. American frigates blockaded ports, bombarded coastal defenses, and worked with local allies in a daring overland attack on Derna. The war ended with a negotiated peace and lowered tribute, but not its complete abolition. The experience taught Americans that they would be dragged into distant conflicts simply by trading overseas, and that their commitment to resisting extortion would sometimes mean fighting wars in places most citizens could barely find on a map. 33. The Burr Conspiracy Trial. Aaron Burr, who had almost been president by accident, was not finished unsettling the new republic after his duel with Hamilton ended one rivalry in blood. By the mid-1800s, Burr drifted westward, talking with frontier leaders, land speculators, and discontented figures along the Mississippi. Rumors swirled that he planned to carve out an independent empire in the Western Territories, maybe seize Spanish lands, maybe even detach parts of the United States itself. Exactly what he intended remains murky, layered in boastful letters, secret promises, and frightened informants. When President Jefferson decided Burr's schemes crossed the line into treason, federal authorities arrested him and brought him east for trial. In 1807, in a Richmond courtroom crowded with spectators and politics, Chief Justice John Marshall presided over one of the first great constitutional showdowns. The government struggled to prove that Burr had actually levied war against the United States, as the Constitution's narrow definition of treason required. In the end, Marshall instructed the jury that mere intent and preparation were not enough. There had to be an overt act of war, witnessed by others. Lacking that, the jury acquitted Burr. He slipped into obscure exile, and the trial quietly set a precedent. Treason would be defined tightly, making it harder for future administrations to brand political enemies as existential traitors. 34. The Embargo Act smuggling boom. Jefferson, who had once celebrated limited government and warned against overreach, tried a different experiment in power a year later that turned whole coastlines into quiet battlegrounds. Frustrated by British impressment of American sailors and French interference with neutral shipping, yet determined to avoid war, he persuaded Congress in 1807 to pass the Embargo Act. It essentially banned American ships from sailing to foreign ports, a sweeping attempt to use economic pressure instead of cannons. The idea was to starve Britain and France of American goods until they respected U.S. neutrality. In practice, it starved American merchants and sailors, especially in New England. Harbors filled with idle ships, warehouses stacked with unsold goods. Unemployment and resentment grew. Along the long, jagged coastline and porous Canadian border, another economy awakened. Smugglers slipped out at night, loading small boats, hugging inlets, dodging revenue cutters, and quietly restoring the trade that official policy had shut down. Local juries often refused to convict their neighbors. States grumbled about federal overreach. The embargo damaged the economy, barely touched European policy, and taught Americans that trying to close off a trading republic from the world could generate more lawbreaking than obedience. Within 2 years, Congress repealed it, replacing it with narrower restrictions, but the memory lingered of a president who had tried to stop war by waging one against his own nation's commerce. 35. Tecumseh's Confederacy. While ships were being seized on distant seas and smugglers threaded through coastal coves, a different kind of resistance was taking shape in the interior. In the early 1800s, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, began urging native nations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast to unite against American expansion. They argued that no single nation had the right to sell land, that it belonged collectively to all native peoples, and that the endless treaties signed by U.S. officials and small groups of chiefs were illegitimate. At Prophetstown, near the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers, they built a multi-tribal community that became both a spiritual center and a political statement. Warriors, families, and emissaries came from many nations, listening to speeches that denounced alcohol, urged cultural renewal, and called for a broad confederacy strong enough to resist the steady push of settlers. American leaders like William Henry Harrison saw the movement as a direct threat and worked to undermine it by signing more land deals and preparing for conflict. In 1811, while Tecumseh was away seeking Southern allies, Harrison's forces attacked Prophetstown at the Battle of Tippecanoe, burning the town and claiming victory. Tecumseh's dream of a united native front was battered but not extinguished. He later allied with the British in the War of 1812 and died in battle. The Confederacy he tried to build stands as one of the most ambitious attempts to create a pan-native resistance to the expanding United States, a reminder that the frontier was not empty, but filled with political visions Americans preferred to forget. 36. The White House burning of 1814. While Tecumseh fought and died in the interior, the war he helped shape eventually reached the American capital in fire and smoke. During the War of 1812, British forces sailed up the Chesapeake, marched almost unopposed toward Washington, and defeated hastily gathered American militia at Bladensburg, a rout so embarrassing it was later called the Bladensburg Races. With the road open, British troops entered Washington on a hot August day in 1814 and set about burning public buildings, including the still new Capitol and the President's House, later called the White House. They piled furniture in rooms, splashed gunpowder and spirits, and lit everything they could, watching the symbols of the young republic buckle and char. President James Madison and his wife Dolly had already fled, Dolly famously taking Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington with her. That night, as flames devoured the city, a violent thunderstorm swept in, with wind, rain, and even what some witnesses believed were tornadoes ripping through the burning Capitol. The storm helped snuff out some of the fires and forced the British to cut short their occupation, an eerie, almost biblical scene of man-made destruction suddenly drowned by the sky itself. The burning humiliated Americans, but also hardened a sense that their fragile republic had survived its worst symbolic attack and would rebuild from ashes. 37. The Hartford Convention. As Washington smoldered and the war dragged on, not everyone in the United States agreed that the conflict was worth fighting, and some quietly wondered whether remaining in the Union was worth it either. In late 1814, with New England's economy strangled by British blockades and Jeffersonian trade policies, leading Federalists from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and unofficial delegates from Vermont and New Hampshire gathered in Hartford, Connecticut. They met in secret, behind closed doors, while rumors outside swirled that they were plotting outright secession from the United States. Inside, they drafted a series of proposed constitutional amendments aimed at protecting New England interests, including limits on embargoes, restricting presidents to a single term, and ending the long pattern of presidents coming from Virginia by requiring successive presidents to be from different states. They complained that the Virginia dynasty and Southern slaveholders steered national policy into costly wars that harmed Northern commerce. The convention's final report stopped short of calling for disunion, but its tone was prickly, suggesting states might have to defend themselves if the federal government would not. Before their delegates could carry the proposals to Washington, news arrived of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans and a peace treaty with Britain. Overnight, the Hartford men looked less like principled constitutional reformers and more like sore losers who had flirted with disloyalty. The convention destroyed the Federalist Party's national credibility, and its shadow lingered, an early example of northern states quietly contemplating exit when they felt the Union no longer served them. 38. The Erie Canal's mule power. After war and political crisis, Americans turned back to building, and one of their strangest, most transformative projects was essentially a long, shallow ditch filled with water and lined with patient animals. In the 1810s and 1820s, New York undertook the audacious plan to dig the Erie Canal, a 363-mile waterway linking the Hudson River to Lake Erie, cutting across forests, swamps, and rocky ridges with little more than shovels, wheelbarrows, and explosives. Critics mocked it as Clinton's ditch, after Governor DeWitt Clinton predicting ruin and mud. Instead, it became a transportation revolution. Instead of relying on river currents or ocean winds, narrow canal boats moved along the man-made water ribbon, pulled steadily by teams of mules or horses trudging along towpaths beside the canal. The animals, harnessed to long tow ropes, provided patient, predictable power, hauling heavy loads of grain, lumber, and manufactured goods at a fraction of the previous cost. Towns sprouted along the route, warehouses rose, and migrants floated westward, carried by the gentle pull of hooves on packed earth. Journey times from the Atlantic coast to the interior shrank, and New York City vaulted into dominance as the nation's busiest port, funneling the West's produce to the world. Beneath that surge of trade and movement was the quiet, repetitive labor of anonymous drivers and their mules, walking the same paths day after day, turning simple animal strength into an engine of continental change. 39. The Missouri Compromise's main connection. As canals stitched regions together, another force was pulling them apart: the question of whether the expanding republic would grow as a nation of slavery or a nation where slavery was contained. By 1819, the delicate balance in the Senate between free states and slave states was threatened when Missouri, carved from the Louisiana Purchase, applied for statehood as a slave state. Northern representatives feared that admitting Missouri without restrictions would tip national power toward the slaveholding South, while Southerners insisted Congress had no right to dictate slavery's existence in new states. After months of bitter debate, Henry Clay helped engineer a compromise in 1820 that operated like a political scale. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but at the same time, the District of Maine, which had long been part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a separate, free state, preserving the numerical balance in the Senate. Additionally, slavery would be prohibited in most of the remaining Louisiana territory north of latitude 36°30°, drawing an imaginary line across the continent, where human freedom and bondage would supposedly be neatly separated. For a time, the Missouri Compromise was celebrated as a statesmanlike solution, but underneath the calm lay a recognition that the Union was now being managed like a fragile equation, with human lives reduced to tallies on either side of an invisible boundary. The inclusion of Maine as a counterweight showed how even distant, forested coasts were pulled into the moral arithmetic of slavery, their political fate yoked to the expansion of human bondage thousands of miles away. 40. The 1824 corrupt bargain charge. As new states joined and regional tensions simmered, presidential politics became more democratic in form and more vicious in accusation, culminating in an election that many voters believed had been stolen in a smoky back room. In 1824, four major candidates all claimed to be Republicans of the Jeffersonian tradition, but represented different regions and factions: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. For the first time, a growing number of states chose electors by popular vote, and Jackson won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but not a majority. Under the Constitution that threw the election into the House of Representatives, where the top three candidates would be considered, and the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, conveniently held great influence. Clay disliked Jackson, whom he saw as a dangerous, unpolished military chieftain, and instead threw his support behind Adams, lobbying members of Congress to back the thoughtful, austere New Englander. When the House voted, Adams won the presidency, and soon afterward he appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, a position from which previous presidents had often risen. Jackson's supporters exploded with fury, calling it a corrupt bargain, claiming Clay had traded his influence for high office, and that the will of the people had been thwarted by an elite deal. Whether there was an explicit bargain remains debated, but the charge stuck like a stain to Adams's administration, and Jackson's backers spent the next 4 years organizing one of the first modern political machines. The sense that an insider deal had overridden popular choice deepened Americans' suspicion that behind formal institutions, quiet arrangements among powerful men decided who ruled. 41. The Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. While white politicians quarreled over corruption and democracy, one native nation quietly used the tools of print and literacy to argue for its own survival. In the early 19th century, the Cherokee Nation in the southeastern United States adopted a written constitution, established schools, and embraced many aspects of American-style governance in a deliberate strategy to prove they could coexist as a sovereign people. Central to that effort was language. A Cherokee silversmith named Sequoyah created a written syllabary for the Cherokee language, an ingenious system of characters that allowed rapid literacy without copying English letters. Within a few years, thousands of Cherokee could read and write in their own tongue. In 1828, the nation launched the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper in the United States, printed in both English and Cherokee using Sequoyah's characters cast into type. Edited by Elias Boudinot, the paper reported on Cherokee politics, laws, education, and land struggles, while also addressing American readers, arguing that the Cherokee were a civilized, organized nation deserving of their treaty rights and territory. Articles condemned proposals for removal, documented illegal intrusions by white settlers, and tried to counter accusations that Native people were obstacles to progress. For a brief period, the Phoenix was a bridge between worlds, proof in ink that Native sovereignty could be expressed through the very medium Americans claimed as the mark of civilization. Yet in the end, neither literacy nor newspapers stopped the rising tide of land hunger. Georgia authorities harassed the press, and under Andrew Jackson, federal policy shifted decisively toward forced removal, eventually silencing the Phoenix as its readers were driven west on the Trail of Tears. 42. The Anti-Masonic Party. As newspapers multiplied and political passions widened, fear took a new, peculiar shape in the 1820s and 1830s, not just of foreign enemies or distant conspiracies, but of secret rituals happening in American lodges. Freemasonry, a fraternal organization with elaborate symbols, handshakes, and oaths, had long attracted prominent men, including presidents and judges. To many, it seemed a harmless club. That changed in 1826 when a man named William Morgan in western New York, who had threatened to publish a book exposing Masonic secrets, disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Local Masons were implicated in his abduction, and many believed he had been murdered to protect the order's mysteries. Public outrage flared, fanned by ministers, journalists, and reformers who saw Masonry as a corrupt, anti-democratic network that placed loyalty to a secret brotherhood above the law. Out of this anger grew the Anti-Masonic Party, the first significant third party in American politics. It organized conventions, nominated candidates, and even ran a presidential candidate in 1832, William Wirt, focusing on opposition to secret societies and calls for greater transparency and moral reform in public life. The party helped pioneer innovations like national nominating conventions and formal party platforms, tools later adopted by major parties. Though the anti-Masonic movement faded within a decade, many of its supporters drifting into the Whig Party, it left behind the enduring suspicion that hidden networks and vows in private rooms might quietly steer public decisions. In a country that liked to imagine its politics were open and Republican, the fear of invisible influence proved a powerful force, one that would resurface in new forms again and again. 43. Prudence Crandall's School. As secret societies stirred fears of hidden power, one Connecticut school teacher quietly became a lightning rod by doing something profoundly simple: admitting black girls to learn. Prudence Crandall ran a small academy in Canterbury in the 1830s, first teaching the town's white daughters reading, writing, and higher subjects considered advanced for young women. When she enrolled Sarah Harris, a local free black woman, white parents erupted, withdrew their children, and pressured her to reverse course. Instead, Crandall leaned into the principle. She closed the school to white students and reopened it as an academy exclusively for black girls, drawing pupils from across New England and even other states. Local whites responded with a campaign of harassment that escalated from boycotts to poisoned wells, smashed windows, and mobs surrounding the building at night. The Connecticut legislature passed the so-called Black Law, making it illegal to operate a school for out-of-state black students without town permission, a statute aimed squarely at one stubborn teacher. Crandall was arrested, jailed, and put on trial, becoming a national symbol for abolitionists who saw her case as proof that Northern racism could be as vicious as Southern laws. Though legal technicalities eventually freed her from conviction, the climate of violence grew so intense that she closed the school in 1834 to protect her students from physical harm. In a country that liked to congratulate itself on Northern Enlightenment, the ordeal of Prudence Crandall and her teenage pupils showed how violently many white communities resisted even the quiet act of black girls learning their lessons in peace. 44. The Nullification Crisis Toast. While a Connecticut village tried to shut down a school, a much larger fight over obedience and defiance simmered in the halls of power, captured in a few carefully chosen words over dinner. In the early 1830s, South Carolina leaders, furious over federal tariffs they believed favored Northern industry at Southern expense, advanced the doctrine of nullification, arguing that a state could declare a federal law void within its borders. Vice President John C. Calhoun championed the idea, sketching a theory where the Union was a compact of sovereign states, not an indivisible nation. President Andrew Jackson, a slave-holding Southerner himself, saw nullification as a direct threat to federal authority, a rehearsal for secession. At a Democratic Party banquet in 1830 honoring Thomas Jefferson, with tension hanging in the air like a storm, Jackson was asked for a toast. He rose and delivered a line that has echoed ever since. Our federal union, it must be preserved. The words were simple, but everyone in the room heard the steel beneath them, an open rebuke to the nullifiers. Calhoun followed with his own toast about the union next to our liberty most dear, signaling that states' rights still came first in his mind. The polite ritual of raising glasses masked a constitutional showdown that would later lead to South Carolina's nullification ordinance, Jackson's forceful threat to use the army, and a tense compromise over tariffs. In that moment, the tablecloth and candles hid the underlying fracture, one vision of a permanent union bound by federal law, and another of fragile ties that any angry state might sever when it chose. 45. Oberlin's integrated education. As presidents and vice presidents sparred over the meaning of union, A small Ohio town quietly experimented with a different kind of radical idea, a campus where race and gender were not automatic barriers to learning. Founded in the 1830s as a religious and reformist community, Oberlin College embraced a mission that blended evangelical faith, abolitionism, and educational innovation. In 1835, the school made a decision that shocked many Americans. It formally admitted black students, becoming one of the first colleges in the country to integrate its classrooms by race. A year later, Oberlin went further by allowing women to pursue full degree programs alongside men, not just separate female courses. This created a rare space where black and white students, male and female, could sit in the same lecture halls, debate theology and philosophy, and prepare for lives as teachers, ministers, and reformers. The experiment did not erase prejudice, and black students at Oberlin still faced discrimination and social barriers, but the institution's policies made it a beacon for abolitionists and progressive families. The town itself became a major stop on the Underground Railroad, with students and professors helping fugitive slaves escape toward Canada, their classrooms blending into a larger network of resistance. While much of the nation insisted that black intellect was inferior and women's minds too delicate for higher study, Oberlin's graduates quietly proved otherwise, scattering across the country as living refutations of those beliefs. In the broader story of American education, the little college in Ohio stood as a reminder that integration and coeducation were not 20th century inventions, but fragile experiments begun much earlier and fought for at great personal cost. 46. The Toledo War. While Oberlin tried to unite people within its walls, two neighboring states nearly went to war over a thin strip of swampy land and a line on a map. In the 1830s, both Ohio and the Michigan Territory claimed a narrow ribbon called the Toledo Strip, running along their border where surveyors and congressional acts had long disagreed. The area contained the small but strategically located town of Toledo and the mouth of the Maumee River, a potential hub for canals and trade routes to the Great Lakes. Ohio politicians, determined not to lose what they saw as their rightful port, pushed their legislature to extend jurisdiction into the Strip, while ambitious Michiganders, eager for statehood, insisted the land was theirs under earlier surveys. Tensions rose as each side sent militias and sheriffs into the disputed area, arresting each other's officials and trading insults, a conflict later mockingly called the Toledo War. Shots were fired once, injuring exactly one man with a minor wound, more a farce than a battle, but the standoff threatened to escalate. The federal government, reluctant to see two of its own jurisdictions fight, brokered a compromise. Ohio kept the Toledo Strip and its future canal connections, while Michigan, as consolation, received most of the remote forested Upper Peninsula, which many at the time considered a frozen wasteland. Decades later, when copper and iron ore were discovered in abundance and forests fed the lumber trade, the supposedly unlucky deal turned into a bonanza for Michigan. What began as a sputtering, almost war over marshland ended with a quiet lesson. Sometimes the territory that looks worthless on an early map hides riches that later generations will depend on. 47. The Alamo's Tejano Defenders. As maps and boundaries shifted, myths began to harden too, none more enduring than the story of a small mission in Texas, often told as a purely Anglo last stand. In 1836, during the Texas Revolution against Mexico, a mixed group of rebels occupied the Alamo in San Antonio, a former Spanish mission turned military post. Popular memory focuses on figures like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, rugged American frontiersmen who died when Mexican forces under Santa Anna stormed the compound. But among the defenders were Tejanos, Mexican-born Texans of Spanish and indigenous descent who opposed Santa Anna's centralizing dictatorship and hoped for more local autonomy. Men like José Antonio Navarro and Juan Seguin supported the rebellion, and Tejano fighters stood on the walls, fired muskets, and died alongside their Anglo counterparts, seeing the struggle as one for federalism within Mexico or for a Texas where their communities might shape their own future. After the fall of the Alamo and later Texan victory at San Jacinto, the new Republic of Texas often repaid Tejano support with suspicion and land seizures, as waves of American settlers treated them as foreigners in their own homeland. Over time, popular retellings of the Alamo increasingly erased the presence of Spanish-speaking defenders, simplifying a complex, multi-ethnic story into a tale of white Americans resisting a foreign invasion. Beneath the slogans about remembering the Alamo lies a quieter memory of Tejano families who gambled everything on a revolution that slowly pushed them to the margins of the very land they fought to defend. 48. The Amistad Africans Revolt. While Texas legends were being polished, another story of resistance played out not on a battlefield but on the deck of a small Spanish ship, its hold crammed with human cargo meant for bondage. In 1839, a group of Mende-speaking Africans were kidnapped in West Africa, transported across the Atlantic in violation of international bans on the transatlantic slave trade, and sold in Cuba. They were loaded onto a schooner called La Amistad for transport along the coast, chained and guarded, destined for plantation labor. Led by a man later known in American courts as Cinque, the captives broke their shackles during a stormy night, seized control of the vessel, and killed several crew members in a desperate bid for freedom. They ordered the surviving navigator to sail them back to Africa, but he secretly steered north and east, hugging the American coastline until a U.S. naval vessel intercepted the ship off Long Island. The Africans were imprisoned and charged with murder and piracy, their fate entangled in questions of property, international law, and the status of human beings torn from their homes. Abolitionists rallied to their cause, arguing in court that since the transatlantic trade was illegal, the captives were not slaves at all but free people resisting unlawful kidnapping. The case climbed all the way to the Supreme Court, where former President John Quincy Adams, now an aging congressman, rose to argue on their behalf. In 1841, the court ruled that the Amistad Africans were free and ordered their release, a rare legal victory against the machinery of slavery. Most eventually returned to Africa, their names largely lost to U.S. memory, but their revolt and court battle exposed the deep contradictions of a nation that tolerated slavery while claiming to defend liberty on the seas. 49. The Creole Revolt. Just a few years after the Amistad, another shipboard uprising revealed how fragile slavery could be when it brushed against different legal shores, this time not in illegal trade, but in the heart of America's coastal commerce. In 1841, the American brig Creole left Richmond, Virginia, bound for New Orleans, carrying more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children in its hold, part of the domestic slave trade that moved human beings like cargo between southern ports. Among them was Madison Washington, an enslaved man who had once briefly escaped to the north, but returned to Virginia to rescue his wife, only to be captured and sold south. During the voyage, Washington and several others planned and executed a revolt, overpowering the crew, killing one guard, and seizing control of the vessel. Rather than steering toward an American port, they forced the crew to navigate to Nassau in the British-controlled Bahamas, where slavery had been abolished in the 1830s. When the Creole arrived, British authorities faced a delicate situation. A foreign ship carrying enslaved people from a country where slavery was still legal, now anchored under a flag that recognized those people as free. After tense negotiations and American protests, British officials allowed most of the enslaved passengers to disembark and granted them their freedom, refusing to return them as property despite U.S. demands. The incident outraged Southern politicians, who saw it as an attack on their rights and a dangerous precedent encouraging further shipboard revolts. The Creole case quietly highlighted how slavery depended on geography and jurisdiction, how a change in water and flag could transform cargo into human beings with rights, and how enslaved people themselves were often the ones to test those boundaries, gambling on the thin line where law and courage might meet. 50. The Great Moon Hoax. While enslaved people were seizing ships for freedom, a New York newspaper was quietly hijacking people's imaginations with something far stranger: life on the moon. In 1835, the New York Sun published a series of articles claiming that the famous astronomer Sir John Herschel had discovered lunar forests, oceans, and fantastic animals through a powerful new telescope in South Africa. The reports described bison-like creatures, blue goats, and most famously man-bats, winged humanoids supposedly living in crystal temples and engaging in peaceful society. Readers devoured the stories, reprinted across the country, treating them as cutting-edge science from a respected observer. The pieces were pure invention, written by a journalist who never visited Herschel and never saw such a telescope. The hoax worked partly because many Americans were just beginning to trust newspapers and scientific authority, unsure where wonder ended and evidence began. By the time the Sun admitted the whole thing was fiction, circulation had soared, and the paper had cemented its place in the market. The episode showed how easily the new mass media could blur the line between reporting and storytelling, turning a quiet summer into a national reverie about bat people on the moon. 51. The Liberty Party's early anti-slavery campaign. while moonbat people fluttered through newspaper columns. A small, serious political movement tried to drag the moral reality of slavery into national elections long before Republicans existed. In the early 1840s, abolitionists frustrated with both major parties' deference to slaveholding interests formed the Liberty Party, a minor party with a major demand: immediate abolition of slavery where the federal government had jurisdiction. They nominated James G. Birney, a former slaveholder turned abolitionist, for president in 1840 and 1844, accepting that they would lose but hoping to force slavery into public debate. The Liberty Party platform opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, denounced the domestic slave trade, and criticized laws like the gag rule that tried to silence anti-slavery petitions in Congress. Their vote totals were tiny by modern standards, but they grew enough in northern states to worry Democrats and Whigs, especially when Birney's votes may have helped swing New York away from Henry Clay in 1844. Though the party soon fractured and gave way to the Free Soil Party and then to the Republicans, its brief existence marked one of the first attempts to build a national political identity around opposition to slavery itself, not just tariffs or banking policy. In quiet campaign meetings and sparse rallies, Liberty Party supporters rehearsed arguments about human rights, federal power, and moral obligation that would later dominate American politics on a much louder stage. 52. The Mormon Extermination Order. As new political parties tried to reshape the national conversation, one young religious movement discovered how quickly a state government could label its very existence a problem to be removed. In the 1830s, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often called Mormons, settled in western Missouri, believing it to be a promised gathering place. Their growing numbers, communal economic practices, block voting, and religious claims that this land held special divine significance alarmed many older settlers, who feared political takeover and cultural displacement. Tensions escalated into skirmishes and mutual violence, with vigilante mobs attacking Mormon communities and some Mormon militias retaliating. In October 1838, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs issued Executive Order 44, declaring that Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary. The language was chillingly literal, giving official sanction to expulsion and potential killing based solely on religious identity. In the violence that followed, including the Haun's Mill massacre, Mormon men, women, and children were attacked, property was seized, and thousands were forced to flee Missouri in winter conditions. They eventually regrouped in Illinois, then moved west to what would become Utah, carrying with them a memory of state-sponsored persecution. The so-called Extermination Order stayed on Missouri's books until it was formally rescinded in 1976, a late acknowledgement that an entire faith community had once been declared unwelcome by official decree. 53. The Seneca Falls Declaration's missing signers. While one religious minority was driven out under an executive order, another group was quietly drafting a different kind of radical document, this time insisting that women were full citizens with rights the law should recognize. In July 1848, reformers gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, for what is often called the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and their allies. The centerpiece of the meeting was a document modeled deliberately on the Declaration of Independence, titled the Declaration of Sentiments, which began with the familiar words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and then extended them to women. It listed grievances: women's lack of property rights after marriage, exclusion from higher education, unequal moral standards, and absence of political representation. The most controversial resolution called for women's suffrage, the right to vote, a demand many thought too extreme and untimely. Over 100 men and women attended the convention and sympathized with its ideas. But when it came time to sign the Declaration of Sentiments, some hesitated. Fears about reputations, churches, and families led several supporters to withhold their names from the document, and over time some who did sign reportedly asked to have their names removed as the controversy grew. Even among reformers, the jump from criticizing laws to demanding full political equality felt like stepping off a cliff. The partial shifting list of signers captures that uneasy moment when a bold idea begins to leave the safety of private agreement and enters the public record, where backing it means attaching your name permanently to a challenge that many still consider unthinkable. 54. The Gold Rush Sea Route Nightmare. While Seneca Falls attendees carefully weighed whether to sign their names, thousands of men on the opposite coast were chasing signatures of a different kind, names on mining claims, reached by some of the longest, most miserable journeys Americans had yet attempted. After gold was discovered in California in 1848, would-be miners from the eastern United States faced a choice: cross dangerous overland trails or sail the long way around South America by sea. Many chose the sea route, boarding crowded ships that traveled down the Atlantic, around the storm-lashed tip of Cape Horn, and up the Pacific to San Francisco, a voyage that could last 5 to 8 months. Conditions on board were often grim: cramped wooden bunks, stale food, brackish water, and outbreaks of diseases like scurvy, dysentery, and cholera spreading quickly in the close quarters. Boredom gnawed at passengers between stretches of sheer terror as ships fought their way through icy gales, rogue waves, and treacherous currents near the Horn, where masts snapped and vessels sometimes vanished without a trace. Some ships mutinied, others turned into floating markets and gambling dens, and a few abandoned captains simply deserted in San Francisco to chase gold themselves, leaving passengers stranded. By the time survivors staggered onto California soil, many had already spent much of their savings on passage and provisions, carrying bodies of the dead in their memory before they ever swung a pick. The romantic image of bold 49ers overlooks how many first had to endure months of unrelenting seasickness, fear, and monotony just to reach the distant hills where fortune might already be gone. 55. The Christiana resistance. While some men risked storms for the dream of gold, others in quieter Pennsylvania farm country risked bullets and hanging for a different treasure: the possibility of freedom for one family. In 1851, in the village of Christiana in Lancaster County, a group of black residents, many of them escaped slaves or the children of those who had fled, lived under constant threat from the recently strengthened Fugitive Slave Act, which empowered slave catchers to seize alleged runaways even in free states. One morning, Maryland slaveholder Edward Gorsuch and a posse of armed men arrived with federal warrants, determined to recapture several men he claimed had escaped from his farm. The fugitives had taken shelter at the home of William Parker, a black farmer and Underground Railroad organizer who believed that violent self-defense was sometimes necessary. As Gorsuch's party demanded entry, Parker and other black men, joined by a few white abolitionist neighbors, refused, leading to a tense standoff. Shots were fired, Gorsuch was killed, and his son was wounded as the would-be captors retreated under unexpectedly fierce resistance. In the aftermath, federal authorities descended on the area, arresting dozens of black residents and several white supporters, charging some with treason for resisting the enforcement of federal law. A sensational trial ended in acquittals and dropped charges, partly because prosecutors feared losing more cases that might embarrass the government. The Christiana incident exposed the collision between a law demanding obedience to slavery and communities that quietly, then loudly, refused to comply. On a small Pennsylvania road, people who were supposed to submit instead chose to stand their ground, knowing that the cost might be their lives. 56. The Know-Nothing Party. As conflicts over slavery, religion, and immigration intensified, a different kind of political movement surged briefly into prominence, built not on expanding freedom but on narrowing who counted as truly American. In the 1850s, waves of Irish and German immigrants, many of them Catholic, arrived in U.S. cities, alarming native-born Protestants who feared job competition, cultural change, and alleged foreign influence from the Pope. Out of these anxieties grew a secretive nativist organization that members called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which soon spawned a political arm informally known as the Know-Nothing Party. The name came from members' habit of saying they knew nothing when asked about the group, reflecting its initiation rituals, oaths, and clandestine meetings. Their platform pushed for longer naturalization periods, restrictions on foreign-born office holders, and laws aimed at weakening Catholic influence in schools and politics. In some cities, know-nothing sentiment fueled riots, church burnings, and violent clashes with immigrant communities, turning neighborhoods into battlegrounds over language, worship, and belonging. For a brief period, the movement achieved startling electoral success, winning local offices, capturing state legislatures, and even sending representatives to Congress, where they advocated nativist policies under the banner of reform. But the rising crisis over slavery eventually fractured the coalition, as members disagreed over whether to oppose or accommodate slaveholding interests, and the party collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen. The know-nothing moment left behind a quiet warning, that fear of newcomers and secretive politics could swell into national power, even in a country that liked to imagine itself as a welcoming haven. 57. Bleeding Kansas ballot stuffing. As nativists railed in city streets, a different kind of mob crossed state lines with ballot boxes in their sights. In the mid-1850s, whether Kansas would enter the Union free or slave was supposed to be decided by its residents, popular sovereignty in action. Instead, thousands of pro-slavery border ruffians rode in from neighboring Missouri on election days, armed with rifles and whiskey, determined to manufacture a pro-slavery majority. They seized polling places, threatened or beat anti-slavery settlers, and openly stuffed ballot boxes with fraudulent votes, sometimes casting more ballots than there were legal residents. Territorial officials, sympathetic to slavery, mostly looked the other way and certified obviously rigged results, giving Kansas a pro-slavery legislature that did not reflect the actual population. Free state settlers responded by forming their own rival government, writing their own constitution, and arming themselves for defense, turning the territory into a low-grade war zone of raids, arsons, and retaliatory killings. Bleeding Kansas became a national symbol of how the promise of democracy could be twisted when those with guns and numbers decided that who counted as a voter was negotiable. 58. The Dred Scott citizenship ruling. While violence raged on the frontier, the Supreme Court tried to settle the slavery question with a decision that instead poured gasoline on it. In 1857, an enslaved man named Dred Scott, who had lived for years with his owner in free territories, sued for his freedom, arguing that residence on free soil made him legally free. Chief Justice Roger Taney's majority opinion did more than deny Scott's claim. It declared that black people, enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The court also ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively striking down earlier compromises and opening all Western lands to potential slavery expansion. The decision stunned many in the North, who saw it as proof that the slave power had captured not just Congress but the judiciary, turning the Constitution into a shield for human bondage. For Black Americans, free and enslaved, the ruling was a chilling announcement from the highest legal authority that the country's promises of liberty were never meant to include them. Instead of resolving tensions, Dred Scott deepened them, making the eventual collision of war feel less like a possibility and more like an approaching certainty. 59. The Utah War. While the Supreme Court erased black citizenship on paper, the federal government also prepared to confront a predominantly white religious community it feared was sliding into open rebellion. In the late 1850s, reports reached Washington that Mormon leaders in the Utah Territory, led by Brigham Young, were defying federal officials, practicing polygamy, and governing the region as a theocracy loyal more to church than to constitution. President James Buchanan, worried about appearing weak, quietly sent an army of several thousand troops west to install a new territorial governor and, if necessary, crush resistance, launching what became known as the Utah War. Mormon settlers, remembering Missouri's extermination order and Illinois persecutions, burned their own supply depots, harassed army supply trains, and prepared mountain passes for defense, determined not to be driven out again. The standoff simmered for months with isolated skirmishes, destroyed wagons, and the horrifying still-disputed Mountain Meadows massacre, in which a Mormon-led militia and Paiute allies killed more than 100 immigrants. In the end, negotiations prevailed. Brigham Young accepted a new governor, federal troops entered peacefully and camped away from settlements, and the conflict ended with far less bloodshed than many had feared. Still, the Utah War quietly revealed how willing the federal government was to consider using military force against a domestic religious minority when questions of loyalty and authority collided. 60. The Pig War. While soldiers and settlers faced off in Utah's mountains, another potential war began thousands of miles away with a single hungry animal in a disputed island. In 1859, on San Juan Island between Vancouver Island and Washington Territory, American settlers and British Hudson's Bay Company employees lived uneasily side by side, both nations claiming the land under a vaguely worded boundary treaty. One day, an American farmer found a British-owned pig rooting in his potato patch, and in anger shot it dead. The pig's owner demanded compensation. The farmer refused, tempers flared, and officials on both sides escalated instead of calming things down. American troops landed, British warships sailed in, and suddenly a dead pig had produced a standoff involving hundreds of soldiers and dozens of cannons staring at each other across a narrow stretch of grass and water. Commanders on the ground, more cautious than the politicians, agreed to joint occupation and strict rules against firing the first shot, turning the crisis into a long, tense waiting game. After years of shared garrisons and quiet negotiations, international arbitration eventually awarded the island to the United States, and everyone went home. The only casualty of the pig war remained the unfortunate hog, a reminder that empires sometimes teetered on the edge of conflict for reasons that looked absurd in hindsight. 61. The Trent Affair. While a pig almost sparked one war with Britain, a Civil War naval stop nearly revived another, this time with the Union already fighting for survival. In November 1861, a U.S. warship, the USS San Jacinto, intercepted the British mail steamer Trent in international waters, acting on intelligence that two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, were aboard. Captain Charles Wilkes seized the envoys, hoping to prevent them from reaching Europe to seek recognition for the Confederacy, and brought them to Boston as prisoners, where much of the northern public cheered his boldness. London did not cheer. The British government saw the act as an insult to its neutral flag and a violation of maritime law, and it began preparing troops and ships for possible war. The Lincoln administration, facing the nightmare of fighting both the Confederacy and the British Empire at once, quietly backed away from public enthusiasm. After tense diplomatic exchanges and some careful legal face-saving, the United States agreed to release Mason and Slidell, disavowing Wilkes's unilateral action without fully apologizing. The two Confederates went on to Europe but failed to win formal recognition, and the immediate crisis passed. In a war remembered for its land battles, the Trent Affair sits mostly in the background, a moment when a single boarding at sea almost widened the conflict into something far more disastrous. 62. The Dakota War of 1862. While Lincoln worried about foreign intervention, a much older conflict erupted inside Union borders, driven less by diplomacy than by hunger and broken promises. In Minnesota, the Dakota people had been forced onto small reservations, promised regular payments and supplies in exchange for vast lands ceded to white settlers. By 1862, corrupt traders, delayed annuity payments, and crop failures left many Dakota families starving, watching grain and food locked in warehouses while their children weakened. When a group of young Dakota men, desperate and angry, killed several settlers after a dispute over eggs, frustration boiled over into a broader uprising led by Chief Little Crow, targeting agencies, forts, and nearby towns. Over several weeks, hundreds of settlers in Dakota were killed in skirmishes, raids, and retaliatory attacks, as frightened civilians fled to hastily fortified posts or deeper east. The U.S. Army, strained by the Civil War, still mustered forces to crush the rebellion, capturing hundreds of Dakota men and subjecting them to hasty, often sham trials that lasted minutes. Lincoln personally reviewed the death sentences, commuting most but approving 38 executions carried out in a single day at Mankato, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Survivors and their families were expelled from Minnesota, shipped away from their homeland, carrying memories of starvation, betrayal, and the gallows. The Dakota War became another quiet example of how, even during a war to end slavery, the federal government's treatment of Native nations followed a much harsher script. 63. The New York Draft Riots. While battles raged at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, another kind of war briefly seized the streets of New York City, fueled by fear, class anger, and racism. In July 1863, the Union introduced a draft law that allowed wealthier men to avoid service by paying a $300 commutation fee or hiring a substitute, a sum utterly out of reach for most working-class laborers. Many white immigrants, especially Irish workers, already resented black New Yorkers, seeing them as competitors for low-paying jobs and blaming them for a war they felt was now explicitly about emancipation. When the first draft lottery numbers were drawn, resentment exploded into 4 days of rioting, with mobs attacking draft offices, government buildings, and symbols of wealth they felt had bought its way out of danger. The violence quickly turned viciously racial as gangs hunted black residents in the streets, lynching men, burning homes, and even destroying the colored orphan asylum, forcing children to flee for their lives. Union troops, rushed from recent battlefields, finally restored order with bayonets and gunfire, leaving more than 100 people dead and parts of the city scarred. The draft riots exposed how fragile Northern support for the war could be when sacrifice felt unevenly distributed, and how easily anger at distant policies could be redirected against the most vulnerable neighbors close to home. 64. The 54th Massachusetts Pay Protest. As New York burned over a draft law, black soldiers in blue uniforms quietly fought a different battle over dignity and wages. When the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first official black regiments, entered Union service, they were promised the same pay as white soldiers, $13 a month plus clothing. Instead, Congress decided that black troops would get less, $10 a month with $3 deducted for uniforms, effectively paying them as laborers rather than as soldiers. The men of the 54th, many literate, many freeborn from the North, understood exactly what this meant. The government that asked them to die for the Union and for freedom valued them less on paper. Led by officers like Robert Gould Shaw but driven by the enlisted men themselves, they refused their pay altogether rather than accept the insult of unequal wages. For months they fought, marched, and bled without taking a cent, turning their payroll records into a quiet civil rights protest long before that term existed. Only in 1864, after political pressure and mounting embarrassment, did Congress finally grant black soldiers equal pay retroactively, an acknowledgement that their stand had forced the issue. By then, many of the 54th who had refused their reduced pay lay buried in mass graves, never personally seeing the government admit that their service and sacrifice were worth the same as any white soldiers. 65. Sherman's bummers. While black troops argued over pay, another part of the Union Army was reshaping the South's landscape and memory by emptying its barns and pantries. When General William Tecumseh Sherman marched across Georgia and into the Carolinas, his campaign relied on foragers, loose bands of soldiers and hangers-on known as bummers, who ranged ahead and to the sides of the main columns. Their unofficial job was to find food, livestock, and supplies for the army by taking them from Confederate farms, plantations, and towns, stripping smokehouses and granaries in the name of military necessity. To white Southerners, especially wealthier planters who had long profited from enslaved labor, the bummers felt like a rolling catastrophe, breaking open cellars, appropriating horses, and sometimes burning what they could not carry. Stories spread of soldiers trading jokes with enslaved people as they carted off their former master's dinner, of silverware hidden in wells and hams, stuffed up chimneys to escape the foragers' search. Sherman did not invent looting, but he harnessed it into a strategy of psychological warfare, showing civilians that the Confederate state could not protect them or their property. The legend of Sherman's bummers later grew larger than the men themselves, becoming a symbol in Southern memory of a war that had marched straight into kitchens and bedrooms, not just onto battlefields. 66. The CSS Hunley. As Union armies trampled crops and railroads on land, a strange experiment in undersea warfare stalked the blockading ships just offshore. The Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley, a narrow hand-cranked iron tube barely wide enough for its crew, was built in secret in hopes of breaking the Union stranglehold on Charleston Harbor. On a cold night in February 1864, the Hunley crept toward the USS Housatonic, carrying a spar torpedo, an explosive charge mounted on a long pole at its bow. The small crew laboriously turned a crankshaft to move the sub forward, guiding it in the dark until the torpedo struck the Union ship's hull and detonated, sinking the Housatonic and making the Hunley the first submarine ever to sink an enemy warship in combat. Moments after its apparent triumph, however, the Hunley itself disappeared, failing to return to shore and slipping into legend. For more than a century, no one knew exactly what had happened, whether it was killed by its own blast, swamped by waves, or disabled by mechanical failure. When the wreck was finally found and raised in the late 1990s, the crew were still seated at their stations, suggesting death had come quickly and quietly. The Hunley became a strange relic of the Civil War, a reminder that even in a conflict remembered for muskets and cannons, people were already experimenting with the technologies that would make future wars deadlier and more secretive beneath the waves. 67. Juneteenth delay. While experimental submarines prowled Atlantic waters, news of a different kind of emancipation traveled across land with agonizing slowness and deliberate obstruction. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863, declaring enslaved people in rebelling states forever free, but that promise meant little in places where Union troops did not yet control the ground. In Texas, far from major battlefields and lightly occupied by federal forces, Slavery continued openly for more than 2 years after the proclamation, as planters and officials simply chose not to inform enslaved people of their changed legal status. Some slaveholders even moved their human property west into Texas, seeing it as a safe haven where emancipation could be delayed indefinitely. It was not until June 19, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston with troops and issued General Order No. 3, that the federal government publicly announced that all enslaved people in Texas were free and that formerly enslaved people should be treated as hired labor if they remained on plantations. For those hearing the news, the day became a mixture of joy, disbelief, and uncertainty. Freedom at last, but with no land, savings, or formal protection from hostile white neighbors. The celebrations that followed, marked by prayer, food, music, and reflection, planted the seeds of what would be called Juneteenth, a holiday that quietly persisted in Black communities for generations before the rest of the country finally began to take notice. 68. The Black Codes. Even as Juneteenth celebrations marked freedom, white lawmakers across the South hurried to write new chains into law books instead of iron. After the Civil War, Southern states passed Black Codes, a patchwork of state and local laws designed to control the labor, movement, and behavior of newly freed Black people without calling it slavery. These codes often required Black adults to sign annual labor contracts with white employers. Those found without papers could be arrested for vagrancy and fined. Unable to pay the fines, many were hired out to plantations, mines, or road crews, effectively recreating forced labor under a different name. Other provisions restricted where Black people could live, banned them from owning certain weapons, limited access to courts, and imposed harsh penalties for supposed idleness or insolence toward whites. The goal was not just economic, it was psychological, signaling that while slavery as a legal institution was gone, white supremacy intended to remain the organizing principle of Southern life. Reports of these laws and their enforcement outraged many in the North, especially members of Congress who had hoped the war's end would bring a real, if fragile, freedom. The existence of the Black Codes helped push moderate politicians toward more radical Reconstruction policies, including new constitutional amendments, but for Black Southerners on the ground, the codes were an immediate reminder that legal documents alone could not transform a social order built on generations of racial control. 69. The Memphis Massacre of 1866. While lawmakers debated how to respond to Black codes, events on city streets made clear how violently some white communities would fight to preserve old hierarchies. In May 1866, in Memphis, Tennessee, a confrontation between recently discharged Black Union soldiers and white city police officials escalated into 3 days of terror. White mobs, joined by some police and firefighters, roamed Black neighborhoods, burning homes, schools, and churches, attacking anyone they found, and targeting symbols of the fragile progress made since the war's end. Dozens of Black men, women, and children were killed. Many more were beaten or raped, and hundreds were left homeless as smoke from destroyed buildings hung over the city. Federal troops eventually intervened to restore order, but the damage, physical and psychological, lingered far longer than the gunfire. Northern newspapers carried reports of the violence, shocking many who had hoped the end of slavery would naturally lead to a peaceful adjustment between races. Congressional investigators documented the massacre in detail, concluding that local authorities had essentially joined in the attacks instead of stopping them. The Memphis violence, along with a similar massacre in New Orleans later that year, helped convince Congress that lenient Reconstruction under President Andrew Johnson was failing, and that more robust federal protection for Black rights was necessary, even if it meant a deeper confrontation with unreconstructed Southern white society. 70. The 14th Amendment Birthright Principle. After massacres, Black codes, and hostile courts, some lawmakers decided that only a fundamental rewrite of citizenship itself could protect freed people. The 14th Amendment, proposed in 1866 and ratified in 1868, did many things, but its opening line quietly carried a revolutionary idea. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. This birthright citizenship clause directly targeted the Dred Scott decision, which had declared that Black people could never be citizens and made clear that the country's membership rules would no longer depend on race or former condition of servitude. For formerly enslaved people, it meant that children born after the war were not just free, but unquestionably American in the eyes of the law, with claims to protection and rights that could not easily be stripped away by state governments. The amendment also promised equal protection of the laws and due process, phrases that would lie dormant for years before becoming foundations of later civil rights struggles. At the time, many white Americans, North and South, did not fully grasp how far-reaching the birthright principle would be, seeing it as a narrow Reconstruction measure rather than a permanent reshaping of national identity. Over time, though, that simple sentence became a quiet anchor in the Constitution, a guarantee that the country belonged, at least on paper, to anyone born within its borders, regardless of what earlier courts, codes, or mobs had tried to say. 71. The Brooks-Baxter War. As new constitutional amendments promised equal citizenship on paper, political power in the South became a battleground patrolled by rifles. In Arkansas in 1872, a disputed governor's race between Republican candidates Elisha Baxter and Joseph Brooks produced two rival governments, each claiming legitimacy, each backed by its own militia. Courts issued conflicting rulings, legislatures flipped sides, and soon Little Rock's streets saw barricades, cannon, and hastily dug trenches as armed supporters of both men traded shots. Black voters, whose ballots had been crucial in the election, found themselves caught between factions that treated their rights as bargaining chips. For weeks, the state effectively had two capitals, two sets of officials signing orders, and no clear authority obeyed everywhere. President Grant eventually sent federal troops, not to endorse radical democracy, but to restore a version of order by recognizing Baxter as governor. The Brooks-Baxter War ended with relatively few casualties compared to full-scale wars, but it sent a loud signal across the South that Reconstruction politics could easily slide into open violence. It also showed how fragile those new constitutional promises were when the people enforcing them were willing to point guns at each other over offices and patronage, leaving Black Arkansans to wonder how secure their votes really were. 72. The Colfax Massacre. While Arkansas's Republican factions fought over which governor's seal was valid, Louisiana offered a bloodier answer to who would control the South's courthouses. After a fiercely contested 1872 election, Black Republicans in the town of Colfax, many of them formerly enslaved men, now serving as local officials or militia, barricaded themselves inside the parish courthouse to protect the results. White Democrats, including members of paramilitary groups, gathered in large numbers, armed with rifles and even a small cannon, determined to overturn the outcome through force. On Easter Sunday 1873, after a tense standoff, the white force attacked, setting the courthouse on fire and shooting Black defenders as they fled the flames, later executing captured men who had surrendered. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 60 and more than 100 Black men were killed, compared to a handful of whites. Federal prosecutors tried to hold some attackers accountable under new enforcement acts, but in 1876 the Supreme Court's United States v. Cruikshank decision gutted those charges, ruling that most protections in the 14th Amendment did not apply to private violence. The Colfax Massacre became both a local terror and a national precedent, signaling that the federal government would not effectively shield Black voters from white supremacist mobs. For many across the South, the message was clear. Elections could be rewritten with bullets, and the highest court would look away. 73. The Freedmen's Bank Collapse. As Reconstruction governments tried haltingly to protect civil rights, newly freed people were also being invited into a financial world rigged against them. In 1865, Congress chartered the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, commonly called the Freedmen's Bank, as a place where formerly enslaved people and Black soldiers could safely deposit wages. Ministers, teachers, and Union officers encouraged deposits, and branches opened near army camps and in southern cities decorated with patriotic symbols and portraits of Abraham Lincoln to inspire confidence. Over the next decade, tens of thousands of Black depositors entrusted the bank with small savings painstakingly scraped together, hoping for homes, schooling, or a cushion against bad harvests. But the bank's white trustees speculated heavily in risky railroad and real estate ventures, ignored rules against unsafe investments, and even engaged in outright mismanagement and fraud. When a financial panic hit in 1873, the institution was already shaky. By 1874 it collapsed, wiping out most of the savings of its roughly 61,000 depositors. Efforts to recover funds produced only partial, delayed payments, with many people receiving pennies on the dollar or nothing at all. The failure of the Freedmen's Bank did more than empty pockets. It shattered trust in formal banking among generations of black families who had been told that this institution represented federal protection. The collapse quietly echoed through decades of economic life, reinforcing the lesson that even when the government's name was on the door, black wealth could vanish overnight. 74. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. As Reconstruction faltered and economic crises deepened, the fault lines of class and labor began rumbling beneath the tracks that bound the country together. In 1877, after a financial downturn, major railroads slashed workers' wages again, leaving men who already worked grueling hours facing hunger for their families. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, railroad workers responded by walking off the job and blocking trains, refusing to let freight move until the cuts were reversed. The stoppage spread like a shockwave along telegraph lines and tracks to Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis, as railroad employees and sympathetic laborers joined in. Trains sat idle in yards, roundhouses were occupied, and in some cities, crowds burned railroad property and fought pitched battles with local militias and federal troops. Governors, unnerved by the scale of the unrest, called in soldiers to reopen the lines, and in places like Pittsburgh and Baltimore, troops fired into crowds, killing dozens. The strike eventually fizzled without achieving workers' demands, but it marked the first truly nationwide industrial uprising in American history. For the owners, it underscored that the federal government would deploy armed force to protect corporate property and keep freight moving. For workers, it was a harsh introduction to the costs of collective action, but also a glimpse of their potential power when they acted together. The summer of 1877 left behind charred railroad yards, bullet-scarred buildings, and a lingering sense that labor conflict would be a recurring feature of America's new industrial age. 75. The Exodusters. While trains carried wage-cut workers and troops across the North, they also quietly ferried another group, black Southerners heading toward a different kind of promised land. In the late 1870s, as Reconstruction governments fell and white supremacist Redeemer regimes took over, thousands of black families in states like Mississippi and Louisiana began organizing a mass migration to Kansas. They called themselves Exodusters, invoking the biblical Exodus, and they sold livestock, pooled church funds, or simply gathered what they could carry to board overcrowded steamboats and trains heading up the Mississippi and over the plains. Rumors and pamphlets had painted Kansas as a place of cheap land, relatively less racial violence, and a history tied to anti-slavery struggle. The reality on arrival was harsher. Disease-ridden riverboat journeys, unscrupulous ticket agents, and prairie towns unprepared for the influx of impoverished newcomers. Many Exodusters ended up in makeshift camps along riverbanks or in sod huts on marginal land, facing harsh winters and scarce work. Yet even with hunger and hardship, the move represented an act of agency, a refusal to stay under systems of debt peonage, political terror, and economic dependency in the Deep South. Black churches, mutual aid societies, and sympathetic Northern charities helped some migrants survive the first lean years. Over time, Exoduster communities took root in Kansas and neighboring states, planting schools, congregations, and small farms. Their journey became an early chapter in a longer story of internal black migration, a quiet rehearsal for the far larger Great Migration of the 20th century, driven by the same search for safety, land, and self-determination. 76. The Chinese Exclusion Act. While Black Americans tested the limits of mobility within the country, another group discovered that the federal government could close the nation's doors almost completely. Chinese migrants had been central to building the Transcontinental Railroad and working Western mines and farms, often accepting dangerous jobs for low pay. As economic downturns hit and white workers looked for scapegoats, politicians and labor leaders stoked anti-Chinese resentment, portraying them as unassimilable threats and accusing them of undercutting wages. Mob violence, discriminatory local ordinances, and segregation spread across Western states, creating a climate where calls for national restriction gained traction. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first major federal law to ban immigration based explicitly on nationality and race, suspending the entry of Chinese laborers and making existing Chinese residents ineligible for naturalization. The law empowered federal authorities at ports to interrogate and detain would-be immigrants, spawning elaborate paper trails and strategies by families trying to reunite. Over the years, exclusions were tightened, extended, and copied into broader Asian exclusion policies, turning what had been framed as a temporary response into a semi-permanent architecture of racialized border control. Chinese communities in places like San Francisco and New York survived through dense networks of family associations and businesses, but they lived under constant threat of raids, violence, and legal limbo. The Chinese Exclusion Act remained in place, in various forms, for more than 60 years, leaving behind a template for immigration restriction that would be applied to other groups in the future. 77. The Krakatoa Red Sunsets of 1883. Even as the United States hardened its borders against certain people, its skies remained open to distant volcanic ash drifting on high winds. In August 1883, the Indonesian volcano Krakatoa erupted with a series of cataclysmic explosions, shattering the island, generating tsunamis, and hurling vast quantities of dust and sulfur high into the atmosphere. That fine material spread around the globe, circling the Earth in high-altitude bands that subtly altered how sunlight scattered and filtered. By autumn, Americans from New York to Kansas began reporting extraordinary sunsets and sunrises, with skies turning deep crimson, violet, and copper, and the sun sometimes appearing as a blood-red disk. Newspapers printed letters speculating about distant fires, divine warnings, or unusual weather, while scientists gradually connected the spectacle to Krakatoa's eruption and the behavior of aerosols in the upper atmosphere. Painters and poets tried to capture the eerie beauty, and some astronomers worried the strange refraction might interfere with observations. The vivid twilight displays lasted, in varying intensity, for months and in some places years, becoming an unintentional global light show powered by a faraway disaster. For Americans living through economic depressions, labor strife, and the uneasy end of Reconstruction, the red sunsets were a rare shared experience that came not from politics or industry, but from the restless geology of a different continent. They also served as a quiet reminder that even in an age before airplanes and satellites, the planet's systems were intimately linked, with one island's eruption tinting the evening light half a world away. 78. The Wounded Knee Ghost Dance Fear. While Americans were marveling at red sunsets, the Lakota were turning to an even stranger vision in hopes of survival. In 1889, the ghost dance religion spread across reservations, promising that through sacred dances and songs, the dead would return, the buffalo would come back, and white domination would fade away. Many Lakota embraced it as a peaceful, spiritual answer to hunger, broken treaties, and forced confinement, sewing special shirts they believed would protect them from bullets. To federal agents and army officers steeped in frontier paranoia, thousands of native people dancing and praying looked like a brewing uprising. Newspapers ran breathless stories about savage rites and imminent massacres, and officials demanded more troops on the plains. In December 1890, soldiers moved to disarm a Lakota band led by Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. A struggle over a rifle turned chaotic. A shot went off, and the troops opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns into a camp of mostly unarmed men, women, and children. Estimates vary, but around 150 to more than 250 Lakota were killed, many shot as they fled across the snow. Soldiers later received medals of honor for the slaughter, and officials framed it as the quelling of a dangerous uprising, not the massacre it was. The ghost dance was effectively crushed under the weight of federal fear and firepower, and Wounded Knee became a grim symbol of how the government preferred to interpret indigenous spirituality as a military threat, rather than a desperate plea for dignity and survival. 79. The Pullman Strike Mail Crisis. As the frontier closed in blood, another kind of war was brewing along the steel rails that stitched the industrial Midwest together. In 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company near Chicago went on strike after wage cuts, protesting not just lower pay but high rents in the company town where Pullman controlled their housing. The strike quickly gained national momentum when the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, called on members to refuse to handle trains pulling Pullman cars. Rail traffic stalled, freight piled up, and passengers fumed as lines across the country slowed or shut down. Railroad executives, alarmed at the disruption, appealed to the federal government, arguing that the strike wasn't just a labor dispute but an attack on interstate commerce and, crucially, the United States mail. They claimed that by blocking trains carrying mail cars, strikers were obstructing the delivery of letters and packages, something Washington couldn't ignore. President Grover Cleveland's administration seized on this justification, securing a federal injunction ordering workers back on the job and labeling the strike a conspiracy against the government. When workers defied the order, Cleveland sent federal troops into Chicago over the objections of the Illinois governor, who insisted state forces could maintain order. Clashes between soldiers, marshals, and strikers turned deadly, with dozens killed and many more injured in street battles and railroad yards. Debs was jailed for contempt of court, the strike collapsed, and Pullman workers returned without achieving their demands. The mail argument provided a tidy legal and patriotic cover for deploying federal power on behalf of corporations, setting a precedent that when labor unrest threatened the flow of commerce and communication, Washington's sympathies would lie with the rails, not the people who laid them. 80. The Wilmington Coup of 1898. While federal troops defended mail cars in the North, a different kind of force was gathering in a coastal city of the New South. In Wilmington, North Carolina, by the 1890s, a rare experiment in biracial democracy had taken root, with black voters and white allies electing a fusionist city government and sending black representatives to office. The city's black middle class owned newspapers, businesses, and property, and its waterfront bustled with trade, challenging myths that interracial politics would lead to chaos. White supremacist Democrats, determined to reclaim power, launched a coordinated campaign of propaganda, intimidation, and paramilitary organizing, painting black political participation as a threat to white womanhood and civilization. On November 10, 1898, after a tightly orchestrated election season steeped in violence, a mob of white men, including prominent citizens, marched on the black-owned Daily Record newspaper office and burned it to the ground. Armed groups then moved through black neighborhoods, shooting residents, forcing officials at gunpoint to resign, and installing their own candidates in city offices despite the actual vote. Dozens of black Wilmingtonians were killed, though exact numbers remain uncertain, and hundreds were driven from the city, their properties effectively stolen as they fled. The coup was not a spontaneous riot, but a planned overthrow of a legally elected government, one of the only successful coups in American history. State and federal authorities did nothing to reverse it, no perpetrators were punished, and many later boasted about their actions in memoirs and speeches. Wilmington was remade as a white supremacist stronghold, and the coup became a blueprint for Jim Crow, demonstrating that with enough guns, lies, and political cover, democracy in the South could be simply erased and rewritten by those willing to shed blood. 81. The Philippine-American Water Cure. As white supremacists rewrote local governments at home, the United States was testing the limits of its power thousands of miles away in a newly conquered archipelago. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. moved quickly from liberating the Philippines from Spain to occupying the islands, sparking a brutal guerrilla conflict as Filipino fighters resisted American rule. Official rhetoric framed the campaign as benevolent assimilation, teaching self-government and civilization to supposedly backward people, but on the ground, soldiers faced ambushes, unfamiliar terrain, and a civilian population often sympathetic to insurgents. In this environment, some U.S. troops turned to harsh interrogation methods to extract information about guerrilla movements, including a technique called the water cure. Prisoners were forced down, their mouths pried open while large quantities of water were poured in, distending their stomachs, then sometimes pressed or kicked to force the water out, simulating drowning and causing extreme pain. Officers and enlisted men later testified about these practices in Senate hearings, describing them as widespread in certain regions, though higher command often portrayed them as isolated excesses. Reports surfaced of entire villages punished, crops destroyed, and civilians herded into so-called reconcentration zones where disease and hunger spread. In the United States, anti-imperialists seized on accounts of the water cure to argue that American expansion had corrupted the nation's principles, turning it into the kind of power it once denounced. The War Department downplayed the reports. Courts martialed a few low-level offenders and insisted that overall conduct had been humane. Yet the testimony and Filipino memories tell a different story, one in which America's first major overseas empire was secured not just by lofty speeches about liberty, but by torture techniques that foreshadowed later debates over waterboarding and the meaning of civilized war. 82. Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching campaign. While imperial wars exposed American hypocrisy abroad, a young black journalist in the South was documenting a homegrown reign of terror with unflinching clarity. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Mississippi during the Civil War and came of age during Reconstruction, using education and determination to become a teacher and eventually a newspaper editor in Memphis. In 1892, three of her friends, successful black grocers, were lynched after a confrontation with a white-owned store, their economic success recast as criminal threat. Outraged, Wells wrote searing editorials questioning the usual justifications for lynching, especially the claim that it was mainly a response to black men assaulting white women. She examined cases one by one, compiling data that showed many victims had been accused of minor offenses or no crime at all, and some had consensual relationships that white communities refused to tolerate. Her writing suggested that lynching was less about punishing individual wrongdoing and more about enforcing racial hierarchy and economic control. White mobs responded by attacking her newspaper office while she was out of town, destroying the presses and threatening her life if she returned. Forced into exile in the North, Wells turned the attack into fuel, traveling across the United States and to Britain, giving lectures, publishing pamphlets like Southern Horrors and The Red Record, and naming names where she could. She gathered statistics, collected eyewitness accounts, and documented hundreds of cases, helping expose lynching as a systemic, organized brutality rather than random frontier justice. Many mainstream leaders, including some white suffragists, found her work too confrontational, but Wells persisted for decades. Her crusade planted the intellectual and moral groundwork for later civil rights campaigns, proving that careful documentation and fearless testimony could challenge even the most deeply entrenched lies about racial violence. 83. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900. While reformers and imperialists debated the soul of the nation, the Gulf of Mexico quietly gathered the worst storm in American history. In early September 1900, a powerful hurricane approached the Texas coast, its exact strength and path poorly understood in an era before satellite tracking and modern forecasting. Galveston, then a booming port city on a low barrier island, had grown wealthy from cotton exports and trade, with elegant homes, bustling wharves, and a reputation as the Wall Street of the Southwest. Some warnings came from Cuban meteorologists and changing barometric readings, but many local officials and residents believed the city could weather any storm, underestimating the danger of storm surge on such low ground. On September 8, the hurricane made landfall, driving a massive wall of water over the island, smashing houses, lifting buildings off foundations, and turning debris into deadly projectiles hurled by wind well over 100 miles an hour. Survivors later described families clinging to floating wreckage, entire neighborhoods erased in hours, and bodies carried away or buried under piles of splintered wood and sand. Estimates put the death toll between 6,000 and 12,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, far exceeding later storms in sheer mortality. In the aftermath, Galveston's leaders undertook a remarkable engineering response, building a long seawall, and even raising parts of the city's elevation by pumping in sand, but the port never fully regained its pre-storm dominance. Houston, with a deeper ship channel and safer inland position, rose instead as the region's commercial center. The Galveston hurricane quietly reshaped the economic geography of Texas and stood as a sober lesson in how a few hours of wind and water could erase decades of human ambition. 84. The Brownsville Affair. In the same decade that storms and imperial wars were remaking the map, racial politics reached into the heart of the U.S. Army. In 1906, black soldiers of the 25th Infantry Regiment, many of them long-serving professionals, were stationed in Brownsville, Texas, a border town where local whites resented their presence. Segregation and daily insults created constant tension, with businessmen and officials complaining that black troops were disrespectful despite a record of discipline. One August night, shots were fired in town, leaving a white bartender dead and a police officer wounded, and townspeople immediately blamed the soldiers, insisting they had seen black men running through the streets. The regiment's officers reported that all their men had been in barracks, and an internal roll call supported that account, but local pressure for punishment mounted quickly. An investigation produced dubious physical evidence, including spent cartridges allegedly planted to implicate the soldiers, and conflicting testimony shaped by racial animosity. Rather than insist on courts-martial and individual trials, President Theodore Roosevelt took an extraordinary step. He ordered the dishonorable discharge of 167 black soldiers, including some who had served for decades, stripping them of pensions and benefits without any of them being formally convicted. Roosevelt framed it as a necessary defense of discipline against a conspiracy of silence, but critics, including black leaders and some white allies, saw it as collective punishment rooted in racism. The discharged men spent the rest of their lives fighting to clear their names, many dying before any resolution came. It wasn't until the 1970s, after new investigations concluded the soldiers had been wrongly blamed, that the Army reversed the discharges on paper and offered symbolic compensation. By then, the Brownsville affair had long stood as a bitter reminder that even in uniform, serving under the flag, Black Americans could see their honor nullified overnight by local prejudice and presidential pen. 85. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory locking doors. In 1911, in a New York garment factory packed with young immigrant women sewing blouses, fire broke out on an upper floor and spread fast through piles of fabric, oil-soaked scraps, and wooden tables. Managers had a routine policy of locking exit doors during work hours to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks, turning stairwells into dead ends when smoke and flames closed in. Some workers found doors bolted, others jammed into narrow stairways already choked with people and fire, while the building's flimsy fire escape twisted and collapsed under the weight of those trying to flee. The elevators ran until they burned out, taking as many as they could in desperate, overloaded trips. Trapped by heat and smoke, dozens of women climbed onto window ledges, some jumping to their deaths rather than burn, their bodies piling on the sidewalks as horrified crowds watched. In less than 20 minutes, 146 workers were dead, many teenagers whose families had crossed oceans for a better life. The owners were tried for manslaughter, but acquitted, paying only small civil settlements that valued each life at a few dollars per week of lost wages. Public outrage over the locked doors and preventable carnage fueled new fire codes, factory inspections, and labor protections, but it took a tower of ash and broken bodies to convince lawmakers that workers deserved more than unlocked exits and a prayer. 86. The Ludlow Tent Colony. 3 years after Triangle, another labor struggle unfolded not in a city high-rise but on the scrubby plains of southern Colorado, where coal miners lived in company towns controlled by Rockefeller-owned firms. When miners struck in 1913 over low pay, dangerous conditions, and company-run housing, they and their families were evicted from company homes and moved into canvas tent colonies supplied by the Union. One of the largest sprang up near Ludlow, rows of tents forming a temporary village with makeshift schools, kitchens, and meeting spaces guarded by pickets who watched for mine guards and strikebreakers. Tensions escalated as private detectives, mine guards, and eventually the Colorado National Guard appeared, with machine guns mounted on hills overlooking the camp. On April 20, 1914, gunfire erupted between guardsmen and the colony, accounts differing on who shot first, but soon soldiers advanced, setting tents ablaze as families fled or hid. After the smoke cleared, searchers found the charred remains of women and children who had taken refuge in a pit under one tent, suffocated and burned as the canvas collapsed. At least 20 people were killed that day, including children and Union leader Louis Ticas, who was found beaten and shot. News of the Ludlow massacre sparked outrage and retaliatory violence by miners across the coalfields in what some call the Colorado Coalfield War. Federal troops eventually restored order, but few officials faced serious consequences, and the companies largely kept control. The tent colony, meant as a refuge from company power, became instead a symbol of how far corporations and the state would go to break a strike, even if it meant burning a village of workers' families. 87. The Silent Sentinels. While miners and factory workers fought for basic safety, another group quietly confronted power in the nation's capital, armed only with banners and stubborn patience. Beginning in 1917, women organized by Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party took up daily positions outside the White House gates, standing in silence with signs quoting President Wilson's own words about democracy and asking why they didn't apply to women. These silent sentinels were the first organized pickets of the White House, maintaining their vigil through heat, cold, and growing hostility as the United States entered World War I. Critics accused them of being unpatriotic for protesting a wartime president, and passers-by sometimes tore their banners or attacked them, while police began arresting the women on charges like obstructing traffic. Instead of modest fines, many refused to pay and were sent to workhouses such as Occoquan, where they endured filthy conditions, verbal abuse, and in some cases force-feeding during hunger strikes. Reports of the Night of Terror, when guards allegedly beat and brutalized prisoners, slowly filtered to the press, shocking the public with the contrast between Wilson's rhetoric abroad and his treatment of suffragists at home. The administration tried to portray the women as extremists, but photographs of well-dressed, respectable citizens behind bars undercut that narrative. Court rulings eventually declared many of the arrests unconstitutional, and the political cost of continuing the crackdown rose. Within a few years, Wilson endorsed a federal suffrage amendment, and in 1920 the 19th Amendment was ratified. The Silent Sentinel's quiet, unbroken line outside the White House had helped shame a wartime government into expanding the vote rather than simply preaching democracy overseas. 88. The Tulsa Race Massacre air attack claims. As women stood silently in Washington, a different kind of storm gathered in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Greenwood, a prosperous black neighborhood, was known as Black Wall Street. In 1921, after a young black man was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator, rumors, newspaper headlines, and white mobs converged on the courthouse, intent on lynching him. Black residents, including veterans, went armed to protect the accused man, and a confrontation escalated into gunfire, giving white Tulsans the pretext to launch a full-scale assault on Greenwood. Over the next day, mobs looted and burned homes, churches, and businesses, killing an unknown number of residents and forcing thousands to flee, while authorities rounded up black survivors into detention centers. Numerous eyewitnesses later reported seeing private airplanes circling overhead, some allegedly dropping incendiaries or firing on people below, though official records remained vague or dismissive about aerial involvement. Whether used for reconnaissance, intimidation, or direct attack, the planes symbolized how modern technology could be turned inward on American citizens rather than foreign enemies. Insurance companies refused to pay claims for burned properties, calling the destruction a riot, and city officials helped bury both bodies and the story itself. For decades, the massacre was omitted from textbooks and public memory, surviving mostly in hushed family accounts and scattered newspaper clippings. Only late in the 20th century did formal investigations and survivor testimonies force Tulsa and the country to face what had happened, an American city where black success was erased by fire from the ground, and possibly the sky, while authorities looked away or joined in. 89. The Bonus Army. A decade after Tulsa, economic collapse filled Washington streets with a different kind of displaced crowd, veterans who had fought in Europe and returned to unemployment lines. In 1932, during the depths of the Great Depression, thousands of World War I veterans and their families converged on the Capitol to demand early payment of service bonuses that weren't scheduled until the 1940s. They built sprawling shantytowns of tents, scrap wood, and cardboard along the Anacostia River and in abandoned buildings, organizing kitchens, sanitation, and even rudimentary security as they lobbied Congress. Many called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, a grim echo of the American expeditionary forces that had marched through French mud. When Congress rejected the bonus bill and President Hoover refused to sign, most veterans stayed, hoping pressure might change minds, while officials fretted about disorder and revolution in the shadow of European upheavals. In July, Washington police tried to clear some buildings, clashes broke out, and shots were fired, killing 2 veterans. Hoover then ordered the army to remove the camps, and troops under General Douglas MacArthur, with officers including Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, advanced with cavalry, infantry, and tanks. Using tear gas and bayonets, they drove veterans and their families from the city, then burned the Anacostia camp, sending flames and smoke over the river as homeless ex-soldiers watched their shelters vanish. The administration insisted it was restoring order, but newsreels of soldiers attacking veterans damaged Hoover's reputation and deepened public sense that the government had abandoned those who once served it. A few years later, under Roosevelt, Congress finally granted a bonus, but the memory of the bonus army lingered as a warning about what happens when promises to veterans become just another deferred debt. 90. The Zoot Suit Riots. While veterans clashed with the government in the 1930s, another generation came of age during World War II, including Mexican-American youths in Los Angeles who embraced zoot suits, high-waisted baggy trousers, long coats, and wide-brimmed hats as bold style and cultural statement. White authorities and much of the press cast the suits as unpatriotic waste of fabric during wartime rationing and linked them to delinquency, gang activity, and supposed racial menace. Tensions rose as sailors on leave complained about harassment and fights with local youths, and the media fanned fears with sensational stories. In June 1943, groups of white sailors and civilians piled into cars and trucks, driving into Mexican-American neighborhoods to hunt down Zoot Suiters, beating them, stripping off their clothes, and parading them through the streets while cheering crowds watched. Police frequently arrested the attacked youths rather than their assailants, charging them with disturbing the peace or vagrancy while largely ignoring the mobs instigating the violence. Other minority groups, including Black and Filipino youths, were also targeted, but Mexican Americans bore the brunt. Their communities left bruised under headlines that framed the events as riots rather than coordinated assaults. City officials eventually banned zoot suits in public and downplayed the racial dimension, blaming individual troublemakers instead of confronting the broader prejudice that had sanctioned the attacks. The federal government worried about the international embarrassment, especially with Mexico a wartime ally, but meaningful accountability remained scarce. Decades later, the Zoot Suit riots would be remembered not as fashion conflicts, but as a vivid example of how wartime patriotism and racial anxiety can combine to justify violence against young people whose greatest offense was dressing differently and refusing to shrink themselves to fit someone else's idea of American. 91 Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. As some Americans were attacked for clothing on the streets of Los Angeles, others fought and died in Europe while their families sat behind barbed wire back home. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government forced more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, into incarceration camps scattered across remote deserts and swamps, citing national security with little evidence. From these same communities, young Nisei men volunteered or were drafted into the army, forming units like the 100th Infantry Battalion from Hawaii and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team from the mainland. They trained under officers who sometimes doubted their loyalty, then were sent to the Italian and European theaters, where they quickly earned a reputation for relentless bravery and high casualties. The 42nd's rescue of the Lost Battalion in France, pushing through murderous fire to reach surrounded Texas soldiers, became legendary, leaving the unit battered but victorious. By war's end, the combined Nisei units had become some of the most decorated for their size and length of service in U.S. military history, earning thousands of Purple Hearts and dozens of Distinguished Service Crosses and Medals of Honor. Many returned to find their homes, farms, and businesses gone, their families still marked by the stigma of suspected disloyalty. For years, their story was largely framed as proof that military service could redeem a marginalized group in the eyes of the nation. Only later did more people question why such redemption was necessary at all, when no mass incarceration had been imposed on German or Italian Americans. In 1988, the U.S. finally issued a formal apology and reparations for the camps, but the quiet heroism of the 402nd remains entwined with that contradiction. Extraordinary service offered by men whose loved ones were imprisoned by the country they fought to defend. 92. The Port Chicago disaster. In July 1944, at a segregated Navy munitions base in Port Chicago, California, mostly black sailors were ordered to load ammunition ships with little training, under relentless pressure to hurry. One night, a massive explosion shattered the pier, vaporized a ship, and killed 320 men, nearly all of them black enlisted sailors. Afterward, surviving workers were ordered back to the same unsafe conditions. 50 refused and were court-martialed for mutiny in a trial watched closely by Thurgood Marshall. The convictions stood for decades, and the dead were buried under patriotic speeches that never mentioned racism or negligence. 93. The Lavender Scare. While McCarthy chased supposed communists, another quieter purge swept Washington, targeting federal workers suspected of homosexuality as security risks. Beginning in the late 1940s and intensifying in the 1950s, agencies investigated employees' private lives, interrogating coworkers, following rumors, and using police records to identify suspected gay men and lesbians. Thousands lost jobs, careers, and pensions, often forced to resign silently to avoid public outing and arrest. The logic claimed that gay people were vulnerable to blackmail, so the solution was to persecute them first. For decades, this state-sanctioned homophobia erased lives as thoroughly as any red list. 94. Operation Wetback. In 1954, the U.S. launched a mass deportation campaign along the southwest border, proudly named Operation Wetback by officials. Immigration agents, local police, and sometimes soldiers swept farms, barrios, and city streets, grabbing people who looked Mexican, demanding papers many citizens didn't carry. Over 1 million people were detained and deported, with estimates suggesting hundreds of thousands were actually U.S. citizens or legal residents caught in dragnet raids. Some were dumped in remote areas of Mexico without food or water. Official reports framed it as restoring order. Families remembered it as state-backed kidnapping wrapped in bureaucratic language. 95. The Little Rock 9 federal escort. 3 years after Brown v. Board of Education, Arkansas still resisted integrating Little Rock Central High School. In 1957, 9 black students enrolled, facing mobs screaming threats, spitting, and promising violence, while the governor used the National Guard to block the schoolhouse door. President Eisenhower finally federalized the Guard and sent in the 1st Airborne Division, paratroopers with bayonets fixed escorting teenagers through hostile crowds. Inside, the Little Rock 9 endured daily harassment, slurs, and attacks from classmates and indifferent teachers. The images of soldiers guarding children expose how deeply some Americans opposed even the slightest steps toward equality. 96. The Green Book. During Jim Crow, simply driving across the country as a black family could be a dangerous gamble. To avoid sundown towns, hostile diners, and gas stations that refused service, travelers relied on a small green guidebook published by Victor Hugo Green, a Harlem postal worker. Updated yearly, it listed hotels, restaurants, beauty parlors, garages, and private homes willing to serve black customers, turning hostile highways into a patchwork of fragile safe zones. Families planned routes carefully, sometimes driving all night to reach a listed stop before dark. The Green Book quietly mapped an alternate America, one built around survival. 97. The Freedom Summer Murders. In 1964, civil rights groups launched Freedom Summer in Mississippi, sending mostly young volunteers to register black voters and run freedom schools. Early in the campaign, 3 workers, James Chaney, a local black activist, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, white Northerners, disappeared after a visit to a burned church. Their bodies were found weeks later buried in an earthen dam, beaten and shot, killed by Klansmen with help from local law enforcement. The case drew national attention, partly because 2 victims were white, forcing the country to confront violence long familiar to black Mississippians. No one faced murder charges in state court for decades. 98. The 1967 Detroit Rebellion. One hot July night in Detroit, police raided an unlicensed after-hours bar in a black neighborhood, arresting dozens of people gathered for a welcome home party. Crowds watched, anger simmered, and soon windows shattered, stores were looted, and fires spread as resentment over years of racism, police brutality, and housing discrimination exploded. The governor called in the National Guard. Federal troops followed, tanks and armored vehicles rolling down city streets. For 5 days, gunfire, beatings, and mass arrests turned neighborhoods into battlefields, leaving 43 people dead, thousands jailed, and entire blocks burned. Official reports spoke of civil disorder. Residents remembered an occupation. 99. The American Indian occupation of Alcatraz. In November 1969, a group of Native American activists calling themselves Indians of all tribes landed on the abandoned federal prison island of Alcatraz. They cited an 1868 treaty promising that surplus federal land should return to indigenous peoples and claimed the island by right of broken promises. For 19 months, families, students, and elders lived there without running water or electricity, broadcasting statements, painting slogans, and drawing reporters from around the world. The government cut power, blocked supplies, and eventually removed the last occupants by force, but the occupation helped spark a modern wave of Native activism. 100. COINTELPRO. From the late 1950s through the 1970s, the FBI ran a secret program called COINTELPRO to expose, disrupt, and neutralize domestic political groups. Civil rights organizations, anti-war activists, black liberation movements, American Indian groups, socialists, feminists, even some environmentalists were infiltrated by informants and undercover agents. The Bureau forged letters, spread rumors, encouraged internal rivalries, and sometimes provoked violence, all while insisting it was protecting national security. The program was only exposed in 1971, when activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and leaked files. Congressional investigations followed, reforms were promised, but surveillance habits proved hard to break. 101. The Move bombing. In May 1985 in West Philadelphia, police laid siege to a row house occupied by MOVE, a black back-to-nature and anti-police brutality group. After hours of tear gas and gunfire, officers used a helicopter to drop a satchel bomb on the roof, supposedly to destroy a fortified bunker. The explosion ignited gasoline on the roof, and officials ordered firefighters to let it burn, hoping to flush residents out. The fire spread down the block, destroying 61 homes, killing 11 people in the MOVE house, including 5 children. No officials were criminally convicted. The city later called it a tragic error.